Hi everyone, if you enjoyed this video please subscribe. If you haven't subscribed yet, I'd love to see you join me. And don't forget to like and let me know what you think in the comments. My name is Ethan Caldwell and I'm a 28-year-old freelance photographer. This is the story of my harrowing experience on Mount Mitchell, the highest peak east of the Mississippi, during the autumn of last year. What began as an ambitious photography project to capture the rare blood moon quickly descended into a terrifying encounter that still haunts me to this day. For weeks, I meticulously planned my ascent of Mount Mitchell. I envisioned a thrilling solo adventure, accompanied only by my loyal husky, Luna. We would conquer the rugged trails, reach a strategic vantage point, and capture a series of stunning photographs as the blood moon rose. The idea of capturing this celestial event from the eastern edge of the continental US felt like the pinnacle of my work. Luna, a rescue dog trained in search and rescue, was the perfect companion. Her keen senses and attunement to changes in weather and environment had proven invaluable on countless trips. Though she couldn't speak, her body language was more than enough to warn me of any impending danger. On the day of my arrival at Mount Mitchell State Park, the weather was perfect. I stopped by the ranger station to double-check conditions, and while most of the staff were friendly, one ranger, Maya Ramirez, seemed particularly interested in my trip. When she learned I was hiking solo, she offered her services as a guide. Maya possessed extensive knowledge of the mountain's trails and backcountry, but she also mentioned unsettling rumors of hikers going missing in recent weeks, especially around the upcoming blood moon. While she didn't explicitly mention anything supernatural, her tone carried a distinct unease. Despite her concern, I declined her offer, feeling confident in my own experience. However, I did ask for some tips on trail conditions and water sources. Maya insisted I camp away from certain old-growth areas, a point she wouldn't elaborate on. Before I could press her for details, another visitor distracted her, and I left the station, dismissing her warnings as mere superstition. Perhaps I should have heeded her advice, considering the historical context of such beliefs. Throughout history, communities have often attributed misfortune and unexplained events to supernatural forces, as seen in the European witch hunts of the early modern period. Later that afternoon, I began my ascent. The initial leg of the hike was peaceful, with towering trees sheltering me from the sun and crisp mountain air invigorating me. Luna bounded ahead, her tail wagging excitedly. By nightfall, I found a clearing to set up camp. As I cooked dinner over a portable stove, Luna curled up beside me, the flames dancing in her bright blue eyes. The next morning, I awoke to an unexpected chill. It was colder than it should have been for that time of year. But I shrugged it off, attributing it to the fickle mountain weather. As I continued my trek, I came across a series of strange symbols etched into the bark of a gnarled tree. They resembled crude stick figures surrounded by jagged circles, reminding me of ancient folklore. Though curious, I dismissed it as the work of bored campers or local teens. Around dusk, as I neared a ridgeline, I heard a voice call my name. Startled, I turned to see a lone figure climbing the trail behind me. He wore rugged hiking gear and had a broad grin on his face. "Ethan Caldwell, right?" he called out. "Maya said I might find you up here." His name was Tommy Green, and he claimed to have run into Maya at the ranger station. He seemed friendly enough, but something about his sudden appearance made me uneasy. He explained that Maya had insisted someone join me, worried I might get lost or run into trouble. While I wasn't thrilled about having an uninvited companion, I couldn't fault Maya for her concern. Besides, Tommy seemed amiable, and his knowledge of the local area might prove useful. We decided to make camp together for the night. However, Luna acted strangely around him, keeping her distance and whining softly whenever he approached. As we set up our tents, I noticed the air growing colder, and an unnatural haze began to form overhead, blocking out the stars. That night, I was jolted awake by Luna's growling. The trees rustled as though something large was moving through them. Grabbing my flashlight, I unzipped the tent flap and caught a glimpse of a tall, emaciated figure darting between the trees. It was fleeting, but enough to fill me with dread. It looked human, yet its movements were too swift, too distorted. Luna barked wildly, yanking at her leash. By the time I scrambled out of the tent, the figure had vanished. Tommy emerged, claiming he'd heard something, but hadn't seen anything. The following morning, we discovered large, elongated footprints pressed into the soft earth around our campsite. Each track was spaced unnaturally far apart, as if the creature had a massive stride. Tommy suggested it was a black bear with a paw deformity, but something inside me knew better. Despite the unease, we continued our climb. The deeper we went, the colder it became, and Luna's anxious behavior persisted. At midday, we caught sight of Maya trudging up the trail behind us. She said she couldn't shake the feeling that we were heading into danger and had decided to follow. I was relieved to see her, but Tommy seemed less enthusiastic. We forged ahead until we reached a narrow plateau not far from Mount Mitchell's highest ridge. Tommy insisted we camp there, claiming it was the perfect vantage point for viewing the blood moon. As we pitched our tents, Maya warned us of an old local legend about a spirit called the Wendigo, a malevolent, cannibalistic entity from Native American folklore. According to the stories, the Wendigo stalked lost travelers, especially during a blood moon. Tommy dismissed her warnings as campfire tales, but Maya's fear was palpable. Night fell, and the blood moon began its ascent, glowing a vivid crimson. A sense of foreboding weighed on me. To my dismay, my camera equipment malfunctioned. The battery drained impossibly fast, and my backup refused to power on. Frustrated, I decided to try again in the morning. As I sat by the fire, I noticed Maya shooting cautious glances at Tommy. Eventually, she muttered something about checking a water source and asked me to come along. As soon as we were out of earshot, she leaned in close. "I don't trust him," she whispered. "He's been involved with some local group. People say they worship forest spirits or something darker. I think he's leading us into trouble." Amaya revealed that she had tried to warn me back at the station, but didn't want to scare me away or make accusations without proof. Now, she was convinced we had to leave immediately. Before I could answer, Luna's ears perked up, and she growled at the surrounding darkness. I whipped my flashlight around, scanning the trees. Flickers of movement caught the edge of my vision, branches snapping, leaves rustling. Something was circling us. A bone-chilling screech echoed through the trees, and Maya and I sprinted back to camp. We found Tommy standing near the fire, gripping a hunting knife. He looked tense but lowered the blade when he saw us. I didn't mention Maya's concerns, but the atmosphere was thick with unease. Another blood-curdling wail rang out, closer this time. Luna barked frantically. "It's out there," Tommy said, his eyes wild. "Some kind of creature." He seemed genuinely startled. Or at least he was doing an excellent job of pretending. We stoked the campfire higher, its flames offering little comfort against the vast darkness. The wind picked up, carrying the stench of decay. My mind flashed back to the footprints around our previous campsite. Could this be the same thing? Midnight approached, and the blood moon cast an otherworldly glow, giving everything a dark crimson tint. A terrifying shriek pierced the silence, closer than ever. Luna howled, baring her teeth. Maya drew a small revolver from her backpack, while Tommy tightened his grip on his knife. Suddenly, the creature emerged from the darkness. It was tall and emaciated, with long, sharp claws and glowing red eyes. Its skin seemed stretched taut over its bones, and its mouth was filled with razor-sharp teeth. It moved with an unnatural speed and agility, its limbs contorting at impossible angles. Panic surged through me. I fumbled for my own knife, but my hands were shaking too badly to grip it properly. Maya fired a shot, but the creature barely flinched. It lunged at Tommy, knocking him to the ground. Tommy screamed as the creature's claws raked across his face. Luna, fearless as ever, leaped at the creature, sinking her teeth into its leg. The creature roared in pain and flung Luna aside. She yelped and landed hard on the ground. I rushed to her side, checking for injuries. Thankfully, she seemed to be okay, but the creature was now turning its attention towards us. Maya fired another shot, this time hitting the creature in the shoulder. It staggered back, howling in fury. Seizing the opportunity, Maya grabbed my hand and yelled, "Run!" We fled into the darkness, the creature's shrieks echoing behind us. We didn't stop running until we reached the tree line, stumbling and falling over roots and rocks. Exhausted and terrified, we collapsed on the ground, gasping for breath. As dawn broke, we cautiously made our way back to the campsite. The creature was gone, leaving behind only a trail of blood and destruction. Tommy was nowhere to be found. We searched for him, but there was no sign of him. Only his discarded backpack and a blood-stained patch of ground. Shaken and exhausted, Maya and I descended the mountain. We reported the incident to the park rangers, but they were skeptical. Without any physical evidence or witnesses, our story sounded like a hallucination brought on by fear and exhaustion. In the weeks that followed, I struggled to come to terms with what I had experienced. The encounter with the creature, the disappearance of Tommy, and the unsettling feeling that something sinister was lurking in the woods continued to haunt me. Looking back, I realized that my experience on Mount Mitchell was more than just a terrifying encounter with an unknown creature. It was a confrontation with the unknown itself, a stark reminder of the mysteries that lie hidden in the wilderness and the fragility of human existence. The strange symbols, the unnatural cold, the eerie sounds, and Luna's reactions all suggest that something supernatural was at play. Maya's warnings about the Wendigo, a creature born from the fears and beliefs of the indigenous people, add another layer of complexity to the events. Perhaps the creature was a manifestation of our collective fears, a product of the stories and legends that have been passed down through generations. Or maybe it was something entirely different, something that defies explanation. Whatever it was, The encounter forced me to confront the limits of my own understanding and the possibility that there are forces at work in the universe that we cannot comprehend. The experience also made me question the nature of reality itself. Was what I saw real, or was it a product of my own imagination? The line between the supernatural and the empirical blurred, leaving me with a profound sense of uncertainty. Ultimately, my encounter on Mount Mitchell was a journey into the heart of darkness, both external and internal. It was a test of my courage, my resilience, and my ability to confront the unknown. While the experience left me with scars, both physical and emotional, it also gave me a newfound appreciation for the power of belief, the importance of listening to our instincts, and the enduring mystery of the natural world. The spring of 2025 brought with it an experience that continues to haunt me to this day. A chilling dance with the unknown that irrevocably altered my perception of reality. Deep within the treacherous embrace of Devil's Backbone, a remote mountain range in North Carolina, I found myself entangled in a terrifying ordeal that challenged my understanding of the world and the lurking shadows that inhabit it. My name is Sarah Jenkins, and at 28 years old, I embarked on what I believed would be another exhilarating adventure. Another conquest for a seasoned hiker like myself. Little did I know that it would transform into a desperate fight for survival against an ancient evil, residing within those misty peaks. An entity that whispered of forgotten terrors and unimaginable power. Devil's Backbone had a reputation that preceded it, woven into the fabric of local lore and whispered among hikers with a mixture of fear and fascination. Tales of unpredictable weather, treacherous trails, and a sinister presence that clung to its slopes like a shroud were commonplace, adding to the allure of the unknown. Stories of vanishings and unexplained accidents were shared in hushed tones, fueling the mystique surrounding this formidable mountain range. Despite the inherent dangers, I felt an irresistible pull towards this challenge, an insatiable curiosity that whispered promises of adventure and a test of my limits. Having conquered numerous backcountry hikes across the country, I decided to enlist the expertise of a local guide, someone who knew the secrets and hidden paths of Devil's Backbone. Friends recommended Jake Martinez, a charismatic North Carolinian in his early 30s, renowned for his unparalleled knowledge of the terrain. They spoke of his intimate familiarity with the trails, his ability to navigate the treacherous landscape with an almost supernatural sense of direction. He agreed to guide me for a reasonable fee, further amplifying my excitement and anticipation for the journey ahead. My cautious best friend, Lily Parker, 27, insisted on joining the expedition. With her level-headed nature and unwavering support, she aimed to keep me grounded, as she put it, a voice of reason in the face of my adventurous spirit. Completing our team was Ethan Brooks, a tech-savvy friend in his early 30s, specializing in high-end hiking and survival gear. He was eager to document the experience for his survival blog, capturing the raw beauty and challenges of Devil's Backbone through his lens. However, his mild paranoia about everything from wildlife encounters to sudden weather changes was well known among us, adding a touch of nervous energy to our group dynamic. Our journey began on a drizzly morning, defying the clear weather forecast that had promised sunshine and clear skies. As I stepped out of my Jeep near the dirt parking area at the base of Devil's Backbone, An oppressive weight settled upon me, an intangible sense of foreboding that sent shivers down my spine. The air felt heavy, charged with an unseen energy that whispered warnings I couldn't quite decipher. Lily, too, felt an inexplicable chill despite the mild temperature, her usually vibrant demeanor subdued by an unspoken apprehension. Only Jake seemed unfazed, greeting us with a friendly smile and the ominous words, "Hope you're ready for the adventure of your lives." At the time, we took his statement as a sign of enthusiasm, a testament to the thrilling experience that awaited us. In hindsight, it feels more like a grim prophecy, a foreshadowing of the horrors to come. Following a narrow trail that snaked along a cliff edge, we ascended into the heart of Devil's Backbone, the path ahead disappearing into the misty embrace of the mountain. Within the first hour, Ethan's top of the line GPS began to malfunction, its location drifting erratically, as if we were teleporting across the map. The digital display flickered with nonsensical coordinates, defying any logical explanation. Simultaneously, my compass needles spun in frantic circles, rendering it useless in our quest for direction. While equipment malfunctions weren't unheard of during hikes, this was undeniably strange, a technological anomaly that hinted at unseen forces at play. Jake's explanation of an quad magnetic field in the rocks seemed unconvincing, his tone flat and guarded, as if he knew more than he was letting on. We established our first campsite on a small plateau, the view obscured by low, hanging clouds that threatened to unleash a downpour at any moment. The air was thick with moisture, and a damp chill permeated our surroundings. As darkness enveloped the mountain, the temperature plummeted dramatically, the warmth of the day replaced by an icy grip that seeped into our bones. Ethan's attempts to record footage for his blog were thwarted by his camera batteries, which drained almost instantly despite being replaced with fresh ones. "I've never seen anything like this," he muttered in frustration, his voice laced with a growing unease. Then, a faint sound pierced the stillness of the night. A distant laughter that sent chills down our spines and raised the hairs on the back of our necks. It resembled the laughter of a child, high-pitched and playful, yet carrying an unsettling undertone that made it feel out of place in this remote wilderness. Lily's face paled as we exchanged uneasy glances across the dying embers of our campfire. Jake dismissed it as the wind, a natural phenomenon playing tricks on our ears, but the unsettling sound was undeniably more sinister, carrying a weight that the wind could not explain. The following morning, a dense fog blanketed the mountain, limiting visibility to a few feet. The world around us was reduced to shades of gray, the trees and rocks appearing as ghostly figures in the swirling mist. Despite Lily's apprehension and suggestion to turn back, my determination to conquer Devil's Backbone overrode my better judgment. The challenge had become an obsession, and the growing sense of unease only fueled my desire to push forward, to unravel the mysteries that lay hidden within the fog-shrouded peaks. Jake assured us he could navigate without the compass or GPS, claiming an intimate familiarity with the trails that bordered on the supernatural. He spoke of landmarks only he could recognize, hidden markers that would guide us through the dense fog. As we pressed on, the terrain grew increasingly treacherous. Loose gravel threatened to send us tumbling down the steep slopes, and the fog disoriented our senses, making each step a gamble. Around midday, I noticed ancient symbols carved into the rock face near a narrow pass, their presence both intriguing and unsettling. Swirling shapes and runes, some partially eroded by the passage of time and others freshly etched as if carved only recently, filled me with an inexplicable dread. The symbols seemed to writhe and twist before my eyes, their meaning obscured yet undeniably potent. I could make out spirals, intricate knots, and what appeared to be stylized figures, their forms both familiar and alien. Jake hurried us along, his unease palpable. "This spot's not safe," he muttered, avoiding any further explanation. His eyes darting nervously towards the fog-shrouded trees. The afternoon brought with it a sense of disorientation, a feeling that we were trapped in a labyrinth of our own making. The path seemed to twist back on itself, leading us in circles despite our efforts to move forward. We encountered the same gnarled tree repeatedly, its twisted branches reaching out like skeletal fingers, each encounter a chilling reminder that we were losing our way. Despite Jake's insistence that we were heading west, his claims felt hollow, his confidence waning with each passing hour. Lily's frustration grew, her voice sharp as she questioned Jake's navigation skills, but he remained evasive, his gaze fixed on the path ahead, his usual charisma replaced by a grim determination. Finally, as the sun began its descent, we stumbled upon a small clearing where we could set up camp. Exhaustion weighed heavily upon us, our bodies aching from the treacherous climb, and our minds burdened by the unsettling events of the day. Darkness descended early, casting long shadows that danced and twisted in the fading light. An oppressive silence enveloped the mountain, broken only by the occasional crackle of a twig or the rustling of leaves, each sound amplified in the stillness. Sleep evaded us as the unsettling events of the day replayed in our minds. The laughter, the malfunctioning equipment, the ancient symbols, and the growing sense that we were not alone in this wilderness. Sometime past midnight, I awoke to Jake hissing my name outside my tent, his voice a hushed urgency that jolted me from my restless sleep. His tone was laced with fear, a stark contrast to his usual confident demeanor. I emerged from my tent to find Lily and Ethan already awake, their flashlights cutting through the darkness, their faces etched with concern. Jake pointed into the fog, his finger trembling, and in the swirling mist, I could just make out a faint silhouette. A small, hunched figure wearing what appeared to be outdated clothes. The child, like apparition, made no sound, simply staring in our direction, its presence both eerie and unsettling. My heart pounded against my ribs like a drum, a primal fear coursing through my veins. I called out, my voice echoing in the oppressive silence, a desperate attempt to break the tension and dispel the chilling apparition. "Hello," I shouted, the word hanging in the air. Swallowed by the fog, the figure took a step closer, then another, its movements slow and deliberate, as if testing our reaction. I moved forward, compelled by an unknown force, a need to confront the figure and unravel the mystery surrounding it. But as my flashlight beam fell upon it, the child vanished into the mist like a wisp of smoke, leaving behind only the swirling fog and a lingering sense of dread. We spent a sleepless night grappling with the unexplainable encounter, tossing out rationalizations that failed to convince us. Exhaustion, hallucination, the fog playing tricks on our eyes. None of it truly explained the chilling apparition, the way it had moved, the way it had vanished into thin air. By morning, we were a group of wary fugitives, our nerves frayed and our senses heightened, every shadow and rustle of leaves a potential threat. Jake, however, insisted on pushing higher into the mountain, claiming a safer plateau with fresh water lay just a few miles ahead. He spoke with a renewed urgency, his words carrying a desperate edge that we couldn't quite understand. Lily's objections were overruled by my stubborn desire to salvage something from this increasingly nightmarish expedition. The need to conquer the mountain, to prove that we were not defeated by fear, had taken root within me. Ethan, though hesitant, agreed to stay with the group, his loyalty to our friendship outweighing his growing apprehension. Continuing our ascent, we hadn't gone far when the situation took a drastic turn, the events unfolding with a terrifying swiftness that left us reeling. One moment we were hiking along a ridge, the path ahead seemingly clear, and the next I found myself in a hidden glade, a place that felt both ancient and malevolent. Strange, twisted trees formed an archway, their branches gnarled and contorted, as if frozen in a silent scream. At its center stood a small stone altar, adorned with the same ancient symbols that had filled me with dread earlier. The symbols were more prominent here, carved with greater detail, their presence radiating an aura of power and darkness. This was no ordinary place, no mere clearing in the woods. It felt like a gateway to something ancient and sinister, a place where the veil between worlds was thin. Suddenly, Jake turned on us, his eyes wild with a mixture of apology and desperation. With lightning speed, he grabbed Lily, twisting her arm behind her back. Her shriek pierced the air, a cry of pain and surprise that shattered the eerie silence of the glade. Ethan and I rushed to her aid, our instincts kicking in. But Jake brandished a hunting knife, its blade glinting menacingly in the dim light. His face was contorted in anguish, his features twisted in a grimace that spoke of inner turmoil, yet his actions were driven by a determined resolve, as though fulfilling a terrible obligation. "You don't understand," he rasped, his voice strained and desperate. "I have no choice." Demands to release Lily were met with defiance as Jake forced her towards the altar, his grip tightening on her arm. Ethan lunged, wrestling with Jake for the knife, a desperate struggle for control. A brief, chaotic melee ensued, the air filled with grunts and the clash of bodies. Jake overpowered him, his movements fueled by a strength that seemed to surpass his lean frame. Blood dripped from Ethan's forearm, where the blade had grazed him, a stark reminder of the danger we were in. In the chaos, Jake dragged Lily deeper into the trees, her terrified cries fading into the oppressive silence of the mountain, swallowed by the dense fog and the growing darkness. Ethan and I pursued them relentlessly, ignoring the sting of branches and the thickening fog that hindered our vision. We scrambled through the undergrowth, our hearts pounding in our chests, our breaths ragged with fear and exertion. We split up briefly, our calls for Lily echoing through the eerie stillness, each unanswered cry amplifying the sense of dread that washed over us. A wave of icy fear gripped me, an instinctive certainty that we were in mortal danger, that we had stumbled into something far more sinister than we could have ever imagined. Seconds later, Ethan's cry pierced the air, a sound of terror and desperation that sent a jolt of adrenaline through me. I raced towards the sound, my feet slipping on the damp ground, my lungs burning with exertion. I found him alone, trembling and pointing towards an opening in the ground, a dark void concealed beneath a rocky overhang. I saw them. He gasped, his voice shaky and filled with fear. Jake. He took Lily through there. There's a cave or something. We discovered a narrow entrance beneath the rocky overhang, concealed by hanging moss that dripped with moisture. A set of roughly carved steps descended into the darkness, the damp air heavy with an unsettling odor that made my stomach churn. With pounding hearts, we ventured into the unknown, our flashlights struggling against an unnatural gloom that seemed to swallow the light, as if the darkness itself was a living entity. Emerging into a damp chamber, the air thick with moisture and the stench of decay, we found Lily bound and gagged, her eyes wide with terror. Jake stood beside her, muttering incantations in a voice that sounded alien and distorted, the words ancient and guttural, unlike any language I had ever heard. Anger surged through me, a wave of fury at his betrayal and the danger he had placed us in. I swung my flashlight at Jake, catching him off guard. He staggered, the impact momentarily breaking his concentration. But before I could react, another figure emerged from the shadows, its presence sending a wave of icy dread through the chamber. It resembled a small child, its form vaguely human, yet distorted and grotesque. Its eyes glowed with malevolent intensity, burning with an unnatural light that seemed to pierce through the darkness. An overwhelming sense of evil permeated the chamber, a suffocating presence that made it difficult to breathe. The child-like creature took a step, its movements jerky and unnatural, and an ear-splitting shriek filled the air, a sound that resonated deep within my skull, causing my vision to blur and a blinding pain to lance through my temples. Ethan crumpled to his knees, screaming and clutching his head, his body racked with agony. Through the agonizing pain, I heard Jake's trembling voice address the being. "Kazazel, I brought you what you wanted. Spare me, please spare me." Azazel, the name whispered in old legends, a demon bound to these ancient mountains, a creature of immense power and unimaginable cruelty. Somehow, Jake had struck a bargain with this entity, a pact sealed in blood and desperation, and we were the offering, the innocent pawns in his twisted game of survival. As Azazel's shriek subsided, an eerie silence descended upon the chamber, a silence that was heavier and more oppressive than the screams that had preceded it. Lily's muffled sobs were the only sound that broke the stillness, a testament to her terror and helplessness. Ethan, still on his knees, reached for Jake's leg in a desperate attempt to pull him down, to break his trance and make him see the horror of his actions. Jake kicked him aside, his face a mask of conflict, then froze, seemingly battling an internal struggle, a war between his humanity and the dark pact he had made. Before I could intervene, Azazel's inhuman eyes flicked towards Ethan, and his body went rigid. A wave of icy coldness swept through the chamber, and a sense of despair washed over me. A chilling premonition that this was only the beginning of our nightmare. What happened next remains a blur, a fragmented tapestry of terror and confusion. I remember a struggle, a desperate attempt to fight against the overwhelming power of Azazel. I remember the chilling touch of the creature, the feeling of icy dread seeping into my very soul. And then, darkness. When I woke, I was alone. The cave was empty, the only sound the dripping of water from the damp walls. Lily and Ethan were gone, vanished without a trace. Jake, too, was nowhere to be found. I emerged from the cave into a world bathed in the soft light of dawn. The fog that had haunted our journey now dissipated, revealing the breathtaking beauty of Devil's Backbone in all its glory. Yet, the beauty was tainted, forever scarred by the horrors I had witnessed. The experience left an indelible mark on my psyche, a chilling reminder of the darkness that lurks beneath the surface of our world. I returned to civilization a changed person, haunted by the memories of Devil's Backbone and the terrifying encounter with Azazel. The ordeal forced me to confront the fragility of life, the unseen forces that shape our destinies, and the enduring power of fear and survival. To this day, I question the nature of the entity we encountered, the motives behind Jake's desperate pact, and the fate that befell my friends. Was Azazel a demon, a malevolent spirit, or something else entirely? Was Jake a victim of circumstance, driven to his actions by forces beyond his control, or was he complicit in the horrors that unfolded? And what became of Lily and Ethan? Did they escape the clutches of Azazel, or were they lost forever in the depths of Devil's Backbone? These questions linger, unanswered and perhaps unanswerable, but one thing is certain: the events that transpired in those fog-shrouded mountains will forever haunt my dreams. A chilling reminder of the darkness that lies hidden within the heart of the world, waiting to be unleashed. My name is Daniel Warren, and this is the story of how a month-long off-grid adventure at Crowder's Mountain, located in Gaston County, North Carolina, transformed into a fight for survival against a malevolent force lurking within the wilderness. In the spring of 2025, I set out with my girlfriend, Maya Rodriguez, and 3 friends, Liam Brooks, Sophie Turner, and Jake Miller, to experience the raw beauty of this unique mountain range. We envisioned capturing stunning photographs, documenting wildlife, and immersing ourselves in the tranquility of nature. Little did we know that our journey would take a sinister turn, leading us down a path of terror and despair. Upon arrival, the majestic silhouette of Crowder's Mountain against the vibrant blue sky filled us with awe. Crowder's Mountain and its neighboring peak, King's Pinnacle, are remnants of a prehistoric range that once dominated the landscape. We ventured deep into the park, seeking seclusion and a true escape from civilization. Our plan was to remain off-grid, disconnecting from the digital world and relying on our instincts and limited resources. However, our initial excitement was soon tempered by the realization that we had underestimated the challenges that lay ahead. Our tents, purchased on sale, proved flimsy, and the dense forest canopy hindered our GPS signals. Despite these early setbacks, we remained optimistic, eager to explore the wonders that awaited us. The first few days unfolded seamlessly. We reveled in the beauty of the wilderness, choosing from a variety of trails that ranged in difficulty from easy to strenuous. We hiked through lush trails, marveling at the breathtaking views from rocky overlooks. The nights were spent under a blanket of stars, sharing stories and laughter around a crackling campfire. Despite minor discomforts like bug bites and hunger pangs, a sense of liberation pervaded our spirits. On the 3rd day, an unsettling discovery cast a shadow over our idyllic retreat. Strange carvings, etched into the bark of trees near our campsite, caught our attention. The intricate symbols, arranged in peculiar patterns, sent a shiver down my spine. Sophie, with her knowledge of anthropology and Appalachian folklore, suggested a connection to witchcraft or local legends. Liam dismissed it as a prank, but Maya, and I couldn't shake off the feeling of unease. It was as though the oppressive humidity and frequent thunderstorms mirrored the growing darkness within the forest. That night, my camera malfunctioned for the first time in its history. The lens refused to focus, and Jake's drone began experiencing erratic GPS signal loss. We joked about electromagnetic interference, but a growing sense of dread gnawed at me. This incident made us reflect on the limitations of technology. While initially, we had perceived our devices as somewhat useless in this wilderness setting, their potential importance in emergencies became starkly apparent. The following morning, as I photographed a clearing, I caught a glimpse of a fleeting figure in the distance. It appeared almost human, but its movements were too swift, vanishing behind the trees like a wisp of smoke. Upon reviewing the photos, I found only a blurred streak where the figure had been. I shared my experience with the others, but they seemed unconvinced, except for Sophie, who wore an expression of fear and recognition. Later that day, while gathering firewood, we encountered a local man with a long beard and piercing eyes. He warned us about venturing too far from the main trails, his voice laced with an eerie tone. "The mountains got its secrets," he cautioned. "You best not stir up what sleeps here." His words lingered in our minds, adding to the growing sense of foreboding. Over the next few days, a series of unsettling events unfolded. Our food supplies dwindled faster than expected, and equipment started disappearing. We initially attributed it to carelessness, but the discovery of a foreign boot print near our tents shattered that illusion. At night, rustling sounds in the undergrowth suggested that we were being watched. The mounting tension culminated in a heated argument about whether to abandon our expedition or persevere. Liam, driven by his desire for adventure and convinced we'd find pristine climbing spots, wanted to delve deeper into the wilderness. Maya, noticing cuts and bruises on her legs from the rough terrain, urged caution and expressed concern for our safety. Jake, frustrated by his malfunctioning drone, argued that we needed to find higher ground for a better signal. Sophie, torn between her fascination with the supernatural and her fear of the unknown, tried to mediate. I, too, was conflicted, torn between my desire to capture the perfect photograph and the growing sense of danger. On the 10th night, Liam vanished. He slipped away without a word, leaving his sleeping bag empty. We searched tirelessly, calling his name until our voices were hoarse, but he was nowhere to be found. By midday, we discovered his backpack at the edge of a ravine, stained with blood. Fear gripped us as we followed a faint blood trail deeper into the forest. The landscape grew darker and more oppressive as we pressed on. The trees loomed closer, and an unnatural silence descended upon us. We stumbled upon a rocky overhang leading to a narrow path that descended into darkness. It was then that Maya screamed. A figure emerged from behind a boulder, rushing towards us with a crazed look in its eyes. It was a thin, ragged figure with wild hair and a crude knife. The figure lunged at Jake, slashing his arm before dragging him away into the woods. Maya and I gave chase, but the attacker was too quick. Sophie, attempting to keep up, tripped and fell, injuring her wrist. Hours later, guided by a trail of blood and disturbed leaves, we found Jake. He lay unconscious in a small cavern, his hands bound, surrounded by cryptic symbols painted on the walls. The air was thick with the stench of decay and damp soil. In the center of the cavern was a stone slab, and atop it lay Jake. A woman, cloaked in darkness, stood over him, chanting in a low, guttural tone. Her face, lined with deep wrinkles and scars, was illuminated by the flickering candlelight, her eyes reflecting a milky glow. This woman, this witch, seemed to embody the legends of the Wampus Cat and other terrifying creatures that stalk the North Carolina wilderness. As we approached, the witch turned to face us, her lips pulling back in a sneer. A sudden force slammed us against the cavern walls, an invisible hand pinning us in place. Pain shot through my shoulder, and Maya gasped for breath. Sophie let out a strangled cry. The witch's gaze, cold and lifeless, seemed to pierce my soul. My mind raced with confusion as fleeting images flashed before my eyes. Liam tied to a tree, battered and bleeding, Jake screaming in agony. Then, from behind me, Sophie rose, her movements jerky and unnatural. Her eyes rolled back, and her voice took on a deep, resonant quality that wasn't her own. Sophie, possessed by the witch's power, lunged at Maya, choking her with unnatural strength. I struggled to intervene, but the words caught in my throat. Sophie grabbed a sharp rock and brought it down on Maya's head. The horror of that moment remains etched in my memory, Maya's lifeless body, a crimson pool forming beneath her. Fueled by a surge of adrenaline and despair, I broke free from the witch's grasp and knocked Sophie aside. The witch's chanting intensified, and the cavern walls trembled. I rushed to Jake, freeing his hands, but he was delirious, barely conscious. As the cavern began to collapse around us, we fled, carrying Jake. The witch hurled another burst of force, striking Sophie and causing her to collapse. I tried to reach her, but the ceiling gave way, sealing the entrance with a cascade of rocks and dust. Sophie's scream was cut short as she vanished behind the rubble. Jake and I stumbled out into the night, tears streaming down our faces. We had lost Maya, Liam was missing, and Sophie was trapped or worse. Jake, delirious and wounded, needed medical attention. We navigated through the treacherous forest, the symbols on the trees seeming to mock us with their faint glow. Shadows danced between the pines, and whispers echoed through the darkness. After what felt like an eternity, we reached the main trail and eventually made it to a ranger station. Our harrowing ordeal was finally over, but the scars of our encounter at Crowder's Mountain would forever remain. At the ranger station, we were met with disbelief and concern. Jake was immediately transported to a nearby hospital for treatment of his injuries and the fever that had taken hold. Despite the skepticism of some, a search and rescue team was dispatched to investigate the disappearances of Liam and Sophie. However, their efforts proved futile. No trace of Liam was ever found, and Sophie's fate remains a mystery, lost within the collapsed cavern. The authorities were baffled by our account, but the physical evidence, Jake's wounds, the blood stains on Liam's backpack, and Sophie's abandoned belongings spoke for themselves. The incident was recorded as a tragic case of missing hikers, with the possibility of foul play. However, the true nature of the events at Crowder's Mountain remains shrouded in secrecy, known only to Jake and me. Crowder's Mountain has a rich and varied history. Once a place of spiritual significance for Native American tribes, it has also witnessed the passage of famed botanist Andra Mecox and served as the backdrop for various settlements and institutions. Yet, beneath this veneer of history lies a darker truth, hinted at in local legends and folklore. The symbols we encountered, both on the trees and in the cavern, remain a source of mystery. Could they be connected to ancient rituals or forgotten practices? Do they hold the key to understanding the witch's power and her motives? These questions linger in my mind, fueling my desire to uncover the truth behind the events at Crowder's Mountain. The recent wildfire that ravaged the mountain adds another layer of complexity to this already enigmatic tale. Was it a natural disaster? Or could it be linked to the supernatural events that unfolded? Did the fire further disrupt the natural balance of the mountain, making it more susceptible to the witch's influence? The events at Crowder's Mountain left an indelible mark on my soul. The idyllic wilderness we sought transformed into a nightmare realm where an ancient evil held sway. I lost my beloved Maya, and the fate of Liam and Sophie remains unknown. This experience has taught me the importance of respecting the power of nature and the unseen forces that may lurk within. While the beauty of the wilderness can be captivating, it is essential to approach it with caution and awareness. The whispers in the woods may hold secrets best left undisturbed. The witch, the symbols, the disappearances, and the wildfire, all these elements intertwine to form a tapestry of mystery and terror. Crowder's Mountain, once a symbol of natural beauty and tranquility, now stands as a haunting reminder of the darkness that can reside within the heart of the wilderness. Perhaps, one day, the truth behind the events at Crowder's Mountain will be revealed. Until then, the whispers in the woods will continue to echo, carrying with them the secrets of an ancient evil and the tragic fate of those who dared to venture too deep into its domain. My name is Jessica Riley, and I'm 28 years old. A little over a year ago, I embarked on a journey into the wilderness, seeking inspiration for my next novel. Instead, I stumbled into a terrifying ordeal that I could never have imagined. I was in a creative rut, struggling to find the words to fill the pages of my next book. My best friend, Lily Thompson, 27, suggested a trip to Mount Mitchell in North Carolina, known for its breathtaking views and dense forests. It seemed like the perfect place to escape the distractions of everyday life and reconnect with my creativity. Lily, an adventurous spirit, was skilled in survival techniques and had a deep confidence in the wilderness that I envied. We decided to hire a local guide, Ethan Walker. For the first few days of our trip, I found him in an online forum where he boasted of his knowledge of the hidden trails on Mount Mitchell. He promised a unique experience off the beaten path, away from the usual tourist crowds. The day we arrived at the base of Mount Mitchell, the air felt heavy, almost oppressive. A park ranger warned us about unpredictable weather and wildlife. But there was an unsettling undercurrent to her caution. "You two be careful out there," she said. "Lots of old stories about this place." I dismissed it as local folklore, but a seed of unease had been planted. We met Ethan near the visitor center's parking area. Tall and lean, with a face partially hidden behind a scruffy beard, he greeted us with a polite smile and a handshake. He was surprisingly quiet at first, but as we set off, he began to share local legends and stories of curses, ghosts, and even creatures that supposedly roamed the high slopes. He spoke with a conviction that made it seem like he half believed them himself. Our gear was basic but sufficient: a tent, sleeping bags, cooking equipment, and enough food for at least 10 days. We carried a small solar charger for emergencies, but Lily insisted on leaving behind most electronics to fully disconnect. We each had a compass and a map, though Ethan assured us we wouldn't need them as our guide. That would be our first mistake, trusting him implicitly. On the first night, we made camp beneath a canopy of towering pines. The area was eerily quiet, with no sounds of owls hooting or insects chirping, just the rustling of leaves in the gentle breeze. Sitting by the campfire, Ethan told us a local legend about doppelgangers. He claimed that somewhere along the slopes of Mount Mitchell, there was a place touched by dark magic. Those who wandered there risked encountering a sinister version of themselves, a double that would mimic them in every way except one crucial detail: it was evil. I tried to laugh it off, but Lily seemed genuinely unnerved, and I couldn't shake off a growing sense of foreboding. The next morning, we noticed something odd. Symbols carved into the trunks of nearby trees, circles with strange intersecting lines. Lily wondered if it was some kind of code or graffiti left by past hikers. Ethan shrugged and suggested it might be related to local witchcraft rumors. He explained that in certain forbidden corners of Mount Mitchell, people supposedly performed dark rituals to summon or control these doppelgangers. It was all so bizarre, yet he spoke about it with a calm familiarity that unsettled me. By the third day, we were deep in the forest, following narrow trails that snaked between massive boulders. The air grew colder, and clouds loomed overhead. Our first major problem arose when both Lily's and my compasses started spinning erratically. Assuming it was an electromagnetic quirk of the area, we relied on Ethan's sense of direction to keep moving. I tried to use my GPS, but the device couldn't pick up a signal. Late that afternoon, we set up camp near a rocky outcrop. That night, while Lily slept, I awoke to a soft crackling in the underbrush. Adrenaline surging, I grabbed my flashlight and peered into the darkness. Just beyond the edge of our camp, I saw myself. The figure stood facing me, the flashlight beam revealing every detail: my face, my jacket, even my slightly hunched posture. But its eyes were cold, distant, lacking any spark of recognition or warmth. It was as if I was staring into a mirror that reflected only emptiness. I blinked in disbelief, and the figure vanished into the darkness as quickly as it had appeared. I spent the rest of the night in a restless vigil, heart pounding, half convinced I'd had a nightmare. In the morning, I told Lily and Ethan about the encounter. Lily was visibly shaken, while Ethan's expression darkened. He asked me to describe what I'd seen, and then muttered about how we'd strayed too far from the usual trails. I felt a surge of anger, questioning why he'd brought us here if he suspected danger. But Lily and I decided to stick with him, hoping that staying together would keep us safe. That was the day everything fell apart. We'd been hiking for about 6 hours, the terrain growing more challenging with steep inclines and rocky paths, made slick by a light drizzle. Suddenly, Ethan announced that he wanted to show us something special, a hidden overlook with a view of the entire valley. Lily hesitated, but I, trying to be open-minded, agreed. We followed him along a faint trail that curved through dense thickets. The trees were thick that sunlight barely penetrated. When we emerged into a small clearing, everything felt wrong. My gut screamed at me to turn around, but it was too late. Standing in a semicircle around us were 4 strangers, all wearing dark outdoor gear, their faces partially concealed by hoods. They were holding odd symbols, small metal talismans with the same circles and lines we'd seen carved into the trees. Ethan spoke calmly, addressing them by name, though I only caught snippets. "We're ready, and the vessel is here." My blood ran cold. Lily and I exchanged a panicked glance. We realized in that moment that we'd been lured into a trap. Ethan motioned to two of the hooded figures, and they lunged at Lily. Before I could react, she screamed, trying to fight back, but they overpowered her. I rushed forward, only to feel a sharp blow to the back of my head. Dazed, I dropped to my knees, my vision swimming. I vaguely recall Lily being dragged away, pleading for help. My world spun, and then everything went black. I woke to darkness, a suffocating blackness broken only by the faint glow of moonlight. My head throbbed, and my hands were bound behind my back with rough rope. Gritting my teeth, I managed to get to my feet. My backpack was gone. The only thing I still had was the battered flashlight in my coat pocket. Cautiously, I stumbled through the trees until I found what looked like a narrow path. I had no real direction, only a desperate need to save my friend. At some point, my flashlight beam fell upon fresh footprints in the muddy ground. There were several sets, as if a group had passed through recently, dragging something. Clutching the flashlight with my bound hands, I followed them deeper into the forest. The wind carried faint echoes of chanting, a low hum that seemed to rise and fall like a heartbeat. Fear pumped through my veins. I edged closer until I saw a decrepit cabin perched on a rocky ledge. Light from within flickered against the windows. The chanting was coming from inside. I crept to the side of the cabin, pressing my ear to the aging wooden walls. Lily's muffled cries sent a jolt of panic through me. I risked a glance through a cracked window. Lily was tied to a chair, eyes wide with terror, a gag in her mouth. Surrounding her stood Ethan and the four hooded figures. On a small table lay a metal bowl, inscribed with the same bizarre symbols. The group's murmured, chanting resonated in the cramped space. Heart hammering, I realized I needed a plan. But my body was trembling, and my bound hands felt useless. I tested the rope, trying to work my wrists free. A few minutes of focused struggle, and it loosened enough to slip my left hand out. As soon as my hands were free, I started searching for a way inside. The old cabin had a back entrance, a flimsy door secured by a rusty latch. I inched it open, praying the creaking hinges wouldn't give me away. Inside, the chanting was louder, echoing off the walls. I could smell burning herbs, a pungent, acrid odor that made my eyes water. A few paces down a cramped corridor, I spotted an open doorway leading into the main room. I heard Ethan's voice, calm yet forceful. Her energy will guide the doppelganger to its host. It's time. My stomach churned. Was Lily to be sacrificed? I refused to let that happen. Biting back terror, I grabbed a loose piece of wood from the floor, an improvised weapon. Then, I burst into the room. For a second, everyone froze. Lily's eyes widened, and she let out a muffled cry of relief through her gag. The hooded figures recovered quickly, two lunging for me. I swung the plank wildly, connecting with someone's shoulder. They stumbled back, gasping in pain. Ethan shouted, "Stop him." His eyes flicked to mine, and a cruel smirk twisted his features. Fury and betrayal flooded me. I feinted left, then darted right, narrowly avoiding a grasping hand. Another figure attempted to block me, but I barreled past, toppling a small table that held the metal bowl. It clattered to the floor, spilling the strange herbs and liquid across the dusty planks. With the circle broken, the chanting faltered. I used the distraction to reach Lily. Her eyes were wet with tears, but I saw relief there. I tore at the ropes binding her until they came loose. Before I could pull her to her feet, hands clamped down on my shoulders. A brutal punch landed on my back, driving the air from my lungs. I heard Lily scream. Ethan grabbed Lily by the wrist, dragging her toward a door at the opposite side of the cabin. I tried to stand, but one of the hooded figures kicked me in the ribs. Pain flared through my side. Groaning, I looked up just in time to see Ethan disappearing outside with Lily. Gathering what little strength I had left, I lashed out with my makeshift plank, knocking one of my attackers off balance. They crashed into another figure, tangling themselves, giving me a precious moment to scramble after Ethan and Lily. I burst out of the cabin and into the night. The moon cast long, eerie shadows through the trees, making it difficult to see. I could hear Ethan's heavy breathing and Lily's muffled struggles ahead of me. He was dragging her towards a dilapidated structure that loomed in the distance, its silhouette stark against the night sky. It looked like an old church, its steeple crooked and windows boarded up. A sense of dread washed over me as I remembered the story of Reverend Alex Harper and his lifelong work ethic, a stark contrast to the sinister events unfolding before me. Adrenaline fueled my pursuit. I pushed through the undergrowth, ignoring the pain in my ribs and the throbbing in my head. As I drew closer to the church, the chanting resumed, louder now, echoing through the trees. Ethan dragged Lily through the crumbling doorway, and I followed, my heart pounding in my chest. The interior of the church was in ruins. Pews were overturned, and dust covered everything. Moonlight streamed through holes in the roof, illuminating the scene before me. Ethan had Lily tied to a pillar, and the hooded figures were forming a circle around them. The metal bowl, now dented and scratched, sat on a makeshift altar, filled with the same strange herbs and liquid. But something else was there, too. Standing beside Lily was the figure I had seen in my camp, my doppelganger. It was an unsettling sight, like looking into a distorted mirror. The figure's eyes were empty, devoid of any emotion, and a malevolent grin twisted its lips. Ethan began to chant, his voice rising in intensity. The hooded figures joined in, their voices a low, guttural hum. The air crackled with energy, and I felt a growing sense of unease. This was more than just a ritual, it felt like something ancient and evil was being awakened. As the chanting reached a fever pitch, the doppelganger turned towards me. Its eyes locked onto mine, and I felt a wave of dizziness wash over me. It was as if it was trying to draw me in, to consume me. I stumbled back, fear gripping my heart. But then, something unexpected happened. Lily, despite being bound and gagged, managed to free one of her hands. She grabbed a broken piece of wood from the floor and swung it at the doppelganger, striking it across the face. The figure recoiled in surprise, and the chanting faltered. The hooded figures turned towards Lily, their attention momentarily diverted. I seized the opportunity. I lunged forward, tackling one of the hooded figures to the ground. A struggle ensued, but I managed to wrest a small knife from their belt. With the knife in hand, I charged towards Ethan. He saw me coming and tried to block my attack, but I was fueled by rage and desperation. I slashed at him, the knife cutting through his arm. He cried out in pain, and the chanting ceased completely. The hooded figures, now in disarray, scattered. I cut Lily free from the pillar, and we fled from the church, leaving Ethan and his followers behind. We stumbled through the woods, our bodies battered and bruised, our minds reeling from the ordeal. We eventually found our way back to a familiar trail and made our way down the mountain. We reported the incident to the authorities, but Ethan and the hooded figures were never found. The experience left an indelible mark on me. It forced me to confront my deepest fears and anxieties, the darkness that lurked within me. In a way, the doppelganger was a manifestation of my own creative struggles, my fear of failure and insignificance. But it also showed me the strength that lies within us all, the power of resilience, and the unwavering bonds of friendship. Lily's courage in the face of danger inspired me, and our shared experience forged a connection between us that will never be broken. This harrowing tale blends elements of suspense, horror, and psychological thriller, leaving the reader with a lingering sense of unease. The isolated setting of Mount Mitchell, with its eerie quiet and dense forests, amplifies the sense of dread and vulnerability. The author skillfully uses sensory details to create a vivid and immersive experience, drawing the reader into the heart of the narrative. The doppelganger phenomenon can be interpreted in several ways. Is it a supernatural entity, a manifestation of dark magic, or a psychological projection of Jessica's inner turmoil? The story leaves this question open to interpretation, adding a layer of ambiguity that enhances the overall mystery. The symbols found on the trees and the metal bowl add to the sense of occult intrigue. While their exact meaning remains unclear, they suggest a connection to ancient folklore or a modern occult practice, hinting at a hidden world operating beneath the surface of everyday reality. The dilapidated church, with its eerie atmosphere and connection to the story of Reverend Alex Harper, further reinforces the theme of the occult and the struggle between good and evil. It serves as a symbolic battleground where Jessica confronts her own inner demons and fights for her and Lily's survival. Ultimately, the story is a testament to the power of the human spirit to overcome adversity. Jessica and Lily's courage, resilience, and unwavering friendship allow them to escape the clutches of a sinister cult and emerge from the ordeal with a newfound understanding of themselves and the world around them. John Riley, a seasoned novelist, sought solace in the embrace of the mountains, hoping to find inspiration for his next work. He envisioned a peaceful retreat with his family in a remote cabin, a place where he could reconnect with nature and delve into the depths of his imagination. Little did he know that their idyllic getaway would soon transform into a terrifying ordeal, forever etching the name, Shadow Walker, into their minds. Before delving into the harrowing details of John's experience, it's essential to understand the entity that plagued his family. The Shadow Walker, as described in various sources, is a malevolent being shrouded in mystery. One account suggests that it originates from an unknown world, neither conforming to Norse cosmology nor the pre-piercing world. These beings are skilled at traversing the veil, a realm between the physical and spiritual worlds, and thrive in darkness while remaining vulnerable in sunlight. Their origins are shrouded in mystery, but it is said that the first Shadow Walkers learned their abilities in great fear, a tribe hiding in darkness from a powerful enemy. They are known to inflict a shadow debuff that greatly reduces the movement speed of enemies who've reached their maximum panic rating, adding to their terrifying nature. Interestingly, the term Shadow Walker has also been used as an American Indian term for one who walks in two worlds. This interpretation suggests a connection between the entity and the ability to navigate between different realms of existence, perhaps the physical and spiritual worlds. However, a different perspective emerges from a shamanic viewpoint. Here, the shadow walker is seen as one who comes to view their shadow as a teacher and who commits to doing the deep personal work that allows them to support others in doing the same. This interpretation challenges the purely malevolent portrayal of the shadow walker, suggesting a more complex and nuanced role. Adding to the complexity, the term shadow walker or shadow goer appears in other cultures as well. In English folklore, the Sejujengan is a mythological creature that shapeshifts. This connection to shape-shifting aligns with the shadow walker's ability to traverse the veil and manipulate its form. The ambiguity surrounding the shadow walker's nature is a key insight that emerges from these various interpretations. Is it a purely malevolent entity, a guide between worlds, a symbol of our own inner darkness, or something else entirely? This ambiguity adds to the entity's mystique and makes John's encounter all the more unsettling. John's encounter with the Shadow Walker took place in the Mount Mitchell area of North Carolina, a region steeped in history and folklore. While the area is known for its natural beauty and challenging hiking trails, it also has a history of strange occurrences and disappearances. Alicia Mitchell, for whom Mount Mitchell is named, mysteriously disappeared in 1857 while attempting to prove his claim that the mountain was the highest peak in the eastern United States. His body was later found at the base of a waterfall, adding an eerie layer to the mountain's history. Adding to the intrigue, a nearby peak, Klingman's Dome, was once believed to be taller than Mount Mitchell, leading to a controversy between Alicia Mitchell and Thomas Klingman. Beyond Mitchell's tragic demise, the region has a rich history. The Cherokee tribe inhabited the area for centuries before being forcibly removed in 1839 during the Trail of Tears. The Cherokee have their own legends and beliefs surrounding the supernatural, which may have influenced the folklore of the region and contributed to the mystique surrounding Mount Mitchell. One of the first Europeans to explore the Black Mountains, which include Mount Mitchell, was André Micox, a French botanist who visited the area in the late 1700s. In the late 1800s, the area experienced exploitation in the form of mining and logging, impacting the environment. However, conservation efforts were also initiated, with the Mentee Mitchell Purchase Unit being among the first ones organized under the 1911 Weeks Act. The geological history of the region is also fascinating. The mountains of the eastern United States are ancient and have been weathered down over millions of years. At the time of Mitchell's death, the Black Mountain was a wild place with virgin forests of spruce and fir, and chestnut trees dominating the lower slopes. These historical and environmental factors contribute to the unique atmosphere of Mount Mitchell, making it a plausible setting for John's encounter with the Shadow Walker. Symbols have long been associated with paranormal phenomena, often serving as warnings, representations of otherworldly entities, or keys to unlocking hidden knowledge. As John and his family settled into the remote cabin, they discovered strange symbols and markings etched into the walls and floors. These symbols, seemingly ancient and imbued with an unknown power, added to the growing sense of unease. One possible interpretation of these symbols comes from the concept of hobo code, a system of symbols used by transient individuals to communicate with each other. If this were the case, the symbols in John's cabin could be warnings or messages left by previous occupants who had encountered the Shadow Walker. Another interpretation links the symbol to cannibalistic rituals, potentially representing a person being hung upside down and bled out. This gruesome interpretation adds another layer of fear and suggests a connection between the Shadow Walker and ancient, dark practices. Interestingly, a similar symbol appears in the television series Yellow Jackets, where a group of teenage girls stranded in the wilderness encounter it in an abandoned cabin. This cabin, while providing shelter, is also associated with the death of a hunter and the potential for cannibalism, suggesting a connection between the symbol and malevolent forces. While the true meaning of the symbols in John's cabin remains shrouded in mystery, their presence undoubtedly played a role in amplifying the family's fear and paranoia. The symbols serve as a tangible manifestation of the unknown, fueling their anxieties and blurring the lines between reality and the supernatural. John's encounter with the Shadow Walker was further complicated by the presence of Tom Reynolds, a disturbed local who sought to exploit the supernatural forces for his own gain. While the research material provides information about various individuals named Tom Reynolds, none directly match the character in John's story. However, we can analyze the available information to understand the potential motivations and behaviors of individuals who might be drawn to the manipulation of supernatural forces. One Tom Reynolds, interviewed in a blog post, shares personal anecdotes about his childhood and experiences with bullying and fear. This individual's story touches upon themes of vulnerability and the impact of negative experiences, which could potentially contribute to the development of a disturbed personality. It's possible that individuals who have experienced trauma or hardship might be more susceptible to the allure of the supernatural, seeking power or control in situations where they feel powerless. The archetype of the trickster, or a manipulator, in folklore and mythology also offers insights into Tom Reynolds' role in the story. Trickster figures often exploit others' vulnerabilities and use deception to achieve their goals. Similarly, Tom Reynolds appears to be manipulating John and his family, using their fear and the mystique of the Shadow Walker to his advantage. While the specific motivations of the Tom Reynolds in John's story remain unclear, his actions suggest a desire for power and control, potentially stemming from past trauma or a need to compensate for feelings of inadequacy. John's story highlights the potential dangers of isolation and the impact of fear on perception. Studies have shown that perceived social isolation can reduce fear extinction, leading to increased anxiety and heightened threat perception. In John's case, the isolation of the remote cabin, combined with the growing fear of the Shadow Walker, could have amplified their anxiety and distorted their perception of reality. The lack of social connection and the absence of external validation could have made them more susceptible to supernatural suggestions and less able to critically evaluate the events unfolding around them. Furthermore, research indicates that loneliness and social isolation can have detrimental effects on physical and mental health, increasing the risk of premature mortality, depression, poor sleep quality, and impaired cognitive function. Loneliness can also lead to unhealthy habits, as individuals lacking encouragement from family or friends may neglect their well-being. The mortality impact of being socially disconnected is similar to that caused by smoking up to 15 cigarettes a day, highlighting the severity of this issue. Chronic social isolation has also been shown to have debilitating effects on mental health in mammals, leading to behavioral changes such as increased aggression, persistent fear, and hypersensitivity to threats. Studies on mice have revealed that social isolation causes the build up of specific neurochemicals, like tachykinin, in the brain, which contribute to these behavioral changes. These findings suggest that social isolation can have profound effects on the brain and behavior, potentially increasing vulnerability to psychological distress and impairing coping mechanisms. In addition to the mental health consequences, isolation and fear can also have significant physical effects. People with generalized anxiety disorder have been found to be at higher risk of coronary heart disease, while anxiety has been linked to increased incidence of gastrointestinal problems, arthritis, migraine, allergies, thyroid disease, and chronic respiratory disorders such as asthma. This connection between mental and physical health further emphasizes the importance of social connection and the potential dangers of prolonged isolation and fear. John's encounter with the Shadow Walker shares similarities with other documented encounters with supernatural entities. Research on entity encounter experiences, particularly those induced by psychedelic drugs like DMT and LSD, reveals common themes and characteristics. These experiences often involve visual and extrasensory perceptions, communication with entities perceived as guides or spirits, and profound emotional responses, including fear, love, and joy. Interestingly, naturally occurring and psychedelic drug-occasioned experiences interpreted as personal encounters with God have also been documented and compared, showing striking similarities in the subjective phenomena and enduring effects. While John's experience was not drug-induced, the reported sensations and emotional responses align with those described in these studies. The sense of a malevolent presence, the strange occurrences, and the lasting psychological impact are all consistent with documented entity encounters. This suggests that regardless of the cause, whether it be a supernatural entity, a psychological phenomenon, or a combination of both, the human experience of encountering something beyond the ordinary shares common threads. Furthermore, the comparison to traditional werewolf stories in Europe and Navajo skinwalker legends adds another layer to the analysis. Both legends feature individuals who gain the ability to transform into animals through some evil act, often involving a deal with the devil or the killing of a community member. This connection to shapeshifting and the association with darkness and evil resonate with the Shadow Walker legend. The universality of supernatural beliefs and experiences is also worth noting. Most cultures have their own versions of vampiric creatures, dragon-like creatures, and other supernatural entities, suggesting that the human tendency to believe in and experience the extraordinary is deeply ingrained in our psyche. While John's experience as an adult is undoubtedly terrifying, it's crucial to consider the potential impact of such trauma on children and teens. Traumatic events, like encountering a supernatural entity, can have profound and lasting effects on young minds. Children and teens may exhibit a range of reactions to trauma, including trouble sleeping, sadness, anger, and regression to earlier behaviors. Very young children might become clingy, fearful, have tantrums, or resume behaviors such as bedwetting or thumb sucking. School-aged children may experience difficulties with schoolwork, get into fights, or isolate themselves socially. Adolescents and teens may turn to substance use as a coping mechanism. It's essential to create a supportive environment for children and teens who have experienced trauma. They need a safe space to ask questions, express their fears, and receive reassurance from trusted adults. Open communication and understanding can help them cope with the emotional and psychological aftermath of the traumatic event. In the aftermath of their encounter with the Shadow Walker, John and his family were left traumatized. The psychological effects of trauma can be profound and long-lasting, manifesting as persistent flashbacks, nightmares, anxiety, and difficulty concentrating. Trauma can also affect one's beliefs about the future, leading to a loss of hope, limited expectations, and fear that life will be cut short. Fortunately, most trauma survivors are highly resilient and develop appropriate coping strategies, including the use of social supports to deal with the aftermath and effects of trauma. It's important to remember that healing is a process, and it takes time. Coping with trauma requires a multifaceted approach that includes self-care, seeking support from loved ones and professionals, and engaging in activities that promote healing and resilience. Following a disaster or traumatic event, most people will ultimately do well and return to their previous level of functioning. However, some individuals may be more susceptible to developing severe symptoms and require additional help. This includes people with a personal or family history of mental illness or substance use, those who have had previous exposure to trauma, those facing ongoing stress or trauma, and those who lack support from friends and family. Pleasant recreational or work activities can also help distract a person from their memories and reactions. Engaging in hobbies, spending time in nature, or pursuing creative endeavors can provide a sense of normalcy and promote emotional healing. It's important to remember that traumatic stress tends to evoke two emotional extremes, feeling either too much overwhelmed or too little and numb emotion. Seeking professional help can assist individuals in finding a balance and appropriately experiencing and regulating their emotions. John Riley's encounter with the Shadow Walker serves as a chilling reminder of the unknown forces that may lurk in the shadows and the profound impact such encounters can have on individuals and families. His story highlights the power of belief, the dangers of isolation, and the psychological impact of trauma. The Shadow Walker itself remains an ambiguous entity, with interpretations ranging from a malevolent being to a symbol of our own inner darkness. This ambiguity adds to the story's unsettling nature and invites deeper reflection on the nature of reality and the limits of human perception. By analyzing the events through a psychological lens and comparing John's experience to other documented encounters, we gain a deeper understanding of the complexities of human perception and the enduring effects of supernatural experiences. The story emphasizes the importance of social connection in mitigating the negative effects of isolation and fear, and it highlights the resilience of the human spirit in the face of trauma. Ultimately, John's story leaves us with a sense of wonder and a lingering question: what truly lies beyond the veil of our everyday reality? And how do we cope with the unknown when it intrudes upon our lives? Perhaps the answer lies in our ability to connect with others, to find strength in shared experiences, and to embrace the power of narrative in making sense of the inexplicable. All right, let me tell you about the time my family and I went on a hiking trip from hell. My name is Sarah Miller. I'm 38, and I'm a middle school teacher. You know, the whole shebang: lesson plans, grading papers, the works. This all went down last October. I thought it'd be a great idea to take the family on a hike through some remote part of the Appalachian Trail in North Carolina. Bonding, fresh air, you get the picture. Famous last words, right? My husband Mark is 39, an IT guy. He's always been into the outdoorsy stuff. Loves a good physical challenge. Then there's our daughter Chloe, who was 12 at the time, sweet kid. But let me tell you, she was way too young for what we were about to face. We also invited my best friend, Beth, and her boyfriend Alex. Beth is a graphic designer, always laughing, always the life of the party. Alex is a nurse, super calm and collected, or so we thought. So, the plan was to spend a week trekking through this isolated section near the Pisgah National Forest. I'm a planner, so I had everything mapped out, or so I believed. We started our hike late in the afternoon. The air was crisp. The leaves were all those amazing shades of orange and red. It was beautiful, I'll give it that. The first couple of days were pretty normal. You know, the usual hiking stuff. Someone misplaced the water filter. Chloe complained about her boots. The nights were freezing. Nothing we couldn't handle. Things started getting weird on the third day. We'd still have our laughs around the campfire at night, but a weird feeling started creeping in, an unease that settled upon our group. We began noticing these strange symbols carved into some of the trees. Jagged lines and circles, they looked ancient. Alex took some pictures, joking that they'd make cool designs, but Beth seemed a little freaked out. She mumbled something about not disturbing ancient sites or whatever. By the fourth day, our GPS devices started acting up. They'd flicker and reset for no reason, and the paper map seemed to lead us in circles. We ended up losing the main trail and had to rely on Mark's compass, which, by the way, was stuck pointing in one direction. The forest felt different too. Every now and then, Chloe would swear she saw someone, a dark figure, moving between the trees. I brushed it off, told her she was imagining things, but honestly, I felt it too, like we were being watched. It was unsettling. It was like there was this heavy, unsettling static in the air that I couldn't shake off. Then, on the fifth day, we ran into this guy, a real character named Jedediah. He just appeared out of the undergrowth, all polite, saying he was a local guide and knew the area like the back of his hand. He offered to show us a Sefer path. Now, I'm usually pretty cautious, especially in the middle of nowhere, but Chloe took to him right away. And Mark was so relieved to have someone who knew the area that he didn't question it. Jedediah had this weathered look, a patchy beard, and these eyes that hardly ever blinked. He led us off our planned route, claiming there'd been a landslide. We followed him, even though something about it felt off. That night, we camped near this rocky outcrop. The wind picked up like crazy, and it got cold bone, chilling cold. After dark, we started hearing these weird noises in the woods, like whispers or chanting, but too faint to make out. Beth and I exchanged worried glances, but neither of us wanted to scare the others. Just as I was finally drifting off to sleep, I heard a scream, a blood-curdling scream. I scrambled out of my tent, but Mark, Beth, and Alex hadn't heard anything. They were sound asleep. But Jedediah was standing outside his tent, staring into the darkness like he knew something we didn't, like he was expecting it. The next morning was foggy, thick, unnatural fog. We packed up camp, everyone on edge. Beth looked like she hadn't slept a wink, said she had nightmares about people with twisted faces in the woods. Alex tried to make a joke about it, but even his voice sounded shaky. Even Mark, Mr. Adventure, seemed withdrawn. We kept going, following Jedediah, who was saying less and less. As we walked, we saw more of those symbols on rocks and trees. They were bigger now, more elaborate. Chloe got really into them, tracing the lines with her fingers, whispering that she could feel something old beneath them. I told her to knock it off, that we needed to stick together. But my stomach was in knots. In the early afternoon, we reached this narrow ravine. Jedediah insisted we had to go down into it to avoid another supposed rock slide. The fog was still thick, and we went down single file, the mud sucking at our boots. At one point, Alex slipped and slid down a few yards, scraping up his knee. Beth patched him up, but I saw the look in his eyes. He was scared. And so was I. It wasn't until we reached a flatter area at the bottom that things went completely off the rails. We were taking a breather, resting on some fallen logs, when Jedediah pulled Mark aside, saying something about a safer way out of the ravine. The rest of us stayed put, waiting for them. A good half hour passed before Mark finally reappeared. He was pale, trembling, and wouldn't meet my eyes. He just shook his head, looking at me like he was desperate, like he was pleading for help. I had never seen him look so scared. Suddenly, a horrible shriek echoed through the ravine. It was the most blood-curdling sound I had ever heard. I spun around and saw Beth being dragged into the fog by something. I could barely make it out. It was human-shaped, but wrong, twisted. "Beth!" Alex screamed, lunging forward, but he slipped on the wet ground, and by the time we got closer, she was gone, vanished. All that was left were some broken twigs and these weird footprints. They looked half human, half animal, with elongated toes and a narrow heel. It didn't make any sense. We searched for Beth, calling her name until our voices were hoarse, but there was no answer. Only silence. Then, out of nowhere, Jedediah reappeared. He was standing on a rock outcropping, a cold smile on his face that made my blood run cold. His eyes, they looked black, empty. "You won't find her," he said, his voice quiet but carrying through the fog. "She's with Malik now." "Malik?" I demanded, my voice shaking. "Who's Malik? What have you done?" But Jedediah just laughed, this eerie, rasping sound that seemed to vibrate in the air. Then, just like that, he vanished into the trees. Mark collapsed to his knees, cursing under his breath. Chloe was clinging to me, shaking like a leaf. Alex stared at the spot where Beth had disappeared, his face etched with despair. I knew I had to do something, had to pull it together. I managed to convince the others that we had to keep moving, that maybe Beth had been taken somewhere nearby. I refused to believe she was gone. I had no idea who or what Malik was, but I knew we had to find Beth before it was too late. The sun was setting, but the dense fog masked the fading light. We were a broken, terrified group, stumbling through the undergrowth. After another half hour or so, we came across a clearing. In the middle stood a rotting wooden cabin. It looked like something out of a horror movie, boarded up windows, the door hanging off its hinges. There were scraps of paper and pieces of clothing scattered around the entrance, and this awful stench, like death and decay, wafted from inside. Alex called out for Beth, his voice echoing in the silence. No answer. We cautiously stepped inside, our flashlights revealing a single, large room. It was a nightmare. The floor was littered with bones, some animal, some human. There were half-decayed remains, two things I can't even bring myself to describe. Chloe gagged, and I quickly turned her away, shielding her eyes. Mark was shouting Beth's name, his voice frantic. Then, we heard a moan from behind a makeshift partition. We found Beth crumpled on the floor, her wrists and ankles tied with rope. Her face was streaked with tears and blood, her clothes torn. Alex rushed to her, nearly sobbing with relief and horror. She was alive but barely conscious. Between shallow breaths, she whispered, It's not human. It's trying to summon something." We freed Beth and tried to tend to her injuries as best we could. She kept mumbling about being coffered to Malik, that name again. It sent chills down my spine. We had to get out of there, but we were completely lost. We had no idea which way to go. Suddenly, a deafening howl pierced the silence. It made every hair on my body stand on end. We turned to see a figure standing in the cabin's doorway. It was Jedediah, but different. His face seemed distorted, like he was wearing a mask made of his own skin. He let out a low, guttural growl, and then he started to change. Right before our eyes, his limbs contorted, his face elongated, until he wasn't human anymore. We were staring at a monster. Chloe later called it a skin walker. I think she had heard stories from her friends. Alex, in a fit of rage and desperation, hurled a piece of broken timber at it. And then we ran. We fled out the back of the cabin, half carrying Beth as she limped along. The creature, Malik, let out an ear-splitting shriek, and we could hear it crashing through the brush behind us, its heavy footsteps snapping twigs and rustling leaves. Chloe screamed that she saw the shape splitting into two, then back into one. Our eyes couldn't track its movements. It was like it was defying the laws of physics, of reality itself. The chase felt like it lasted forever. We ran until our lungs burned, weaving through thick undergrowth, the forest floor slick with mud and damp leaves. Branches whipped at our faces, and every step threatened to send us sprawling. At one point, Chloe cried out, saying she saw another figure running alongside us, just out of sight. I was too terrified to look, too focused on putting one foot in front of the other. Adrenaline was the only thing keeping us going. Finally, we broke through a cluster of pines and into another clearing. Darkness had almost completely swallowed the land by then, but the moonlight offered some faint illumination. The clearing was scattered with more of those strange symbols etched into stones. Alex stumbled and fell to his knees, completely winded. Beth sank down beside him, trembling uncontrollably. Mark pulled me aside, his face a mask of terror. "Sarah," he whispered urgently, "Jedediah told me things. Things about Malik. He said it's older than these mountains. It can take any form, human, animal, something in between. He said the local tribes used to perform rituals to keep it at bay, but those rituals are lost now. Now it's free. My stomach lurched. Why would Jedi die? Mark hesitated, swallowing hard. He's part of this cult, I guess. He said they want to feed Malik fresh souls to maintain its power. Before I could respond, Chloe gasped and pointed a shaking finger at Alex. He had collapsed fully onto the ground, his eyes rolling back into his head. Beth tried to help him, but he suddenly jerked upright, his face contorting as if in immense pain. He let out a guttural moan, grabbed Beth by the arm, and yanked her close. I rushed forward to pull them apart, but Alex shoved me away with inhuman strength. Then he pinned Beth to the ground. I was horrified. I realized that something else was controlling him. It was Malik. It took both Mark and me to wrestle Alex off Beth. She scrambled back, tears streaming down her face. He's possessed, she choked out. It's Malik's presence. It can get inside your head. Alex lunged for me next, his eyes glazed with a predatory fury. But then Chloe stepped between us. She locked eyes with him, tears staining her cheeks. For a moment, he hesitated, confusion flickering in his gaze. Then, with a roar, he grabbed Chloe by the shoulders. In a burst of panic, Mark tackled Alex, sending them both tumbling onto the damp leaves. They struggled violently, Alex thrashing like a wild animal, because that was what he had become. I screamed, trying to pull them apart, but it was no use. Alex's face had twisted into a mask of rage. He snapped his teeth at Mark, nearly biting his arm. Then I saw the glint of metal. Mark had drawn his hunting knife. The world seemed to slow down. I saw it all happening in agonizing detail. Alex was about to crush Chloe's windpipe with his bare hands. With no other choice, Mark drove the blade deep into Alex's side. Alex made a strangled sound, his eyes widening. He stared at Mark in shock, then let Chloe go. With a soft gasp, he collapsed onto his back. Beth crawled to him, sobbing, trying to stanch the blood flow, but there was too much. In the moonlight, Alex's face relaxed, the malevolent possession receding, leaving behind only terror and regret. He died moments later, his blood soaking into the ground while Beth begged him to hold on. We barely had time to grieve. A low growl resonated through the clearing. Malik had found us again. This time, it appeared as a towering, bipedal beast, its limbs unnervingly long, claws scraping the ground. Mark dragged Chloe behind him, and we stood in front of Beth, who was still crouched over Alex's body, a shield of protection for the woman we failed to protect once already. Malik advanced slowly, relishing our horror. It was then that Chloe, bless her heart, seemed to sense something. She grabbed my hand and pointed deeper into the woods. I saw a flicker of movement, maybe a faint light. It was a long shot, but it was all we had. Without another word, we ran again, leaving Alex's body behind. Beth managed to stand, but she was in shock, tears silently streaming down her face. We raced through the forest, Malik's unearthly howls echoing behind us. The trees ended abruptly at a wide ridge. Below lay another ravine and a trail that might have once been a road. Near the bottom of the slope, we saw another structure, smaller than the cabin, but still intact. We slid down the slope, using rocks and roots to steady ourselves. My heart was pounding in my chest, sure that this place would either be our salvation or our doom. When we reached the structure, a ramshackle shack with a collapsed roof on one side, Beth keeled over, retching from pain and exhaustion. Inside, it smelled of rotten wet dirt, but at least it offered some shelter. We barricaded what remained of the door with debris and huddled together in the darkness. Mark wrapped his arms around Chloe, who stared blankly ahead, silent tears tracking down her cheeks. I crouched beside Beth, checking her wounds as best I could. A scratchy whisper slid through the walls, or maybe it was inside our minds. It was Malik's voice, beckoning us out. The roof creaked as something heavy paced above, scraping back and forth, searching for a way in. I felt every cell in my body trembling with fear. We had lost Alex. Beth was alive but barely able to move. Chloe wouldn't speak. Mark was trying to stay strong, but I could see the guilt etched in his face, the awful reality that he had killed his friend. We must have dozed off in that terror, because when I next opened my eyes, pale morning light seeped through the cracks in the shack's rotted boards. A hush blanketed the forest. I shook Beth gently awake, then Chloe, then Mark. None of us wanted to speak aloud. We knew Malik was still out there. We decided we had to keep moving. Beth limped beside me, leaning on a makeshift crutch we fashioned out of a sturdy branch. We had no compass, no functioning GPS, barely any food, and no idea how to get back to civilization. The only plan was to walk downhill, hoping to eventually hit a service road or a stream we could follow. Exhaustion made the journey a living nightmare. Chloe stumbled often, her eyes glassy. Mark and I practically had to carry Beth after a couple of hours. Then, we stumbled upon a wide dirt path. Relief washed over me, but it was short-lived. Because at that very moment, Malik appeared at the edge of the tree line, standing on two legs like a person, wearing a grotesque mockery of Alex's face like a mask. My mind reeled. The creature stepped toward us, each movement disjointed. Without a word, we turned and fled down the dirt path, the pounding of my heart nearly blocking out the creature's menacing growl. Then, a shot rang out in the distance. Then another. We froze. Maybe hunters, or rescue. We were desperate enough to hope. Help, I screamed, ignoring the rawness in my throat. Beth echoed my cry, as did Mark. We raced toward the sound, heedless of the risk of revealing ourselves to more danger. Anything was better than Malik's clutches. We emerged from the path to find a group of men with rifles standing around a couple of black SUVs. Their badges glinted in the morning light, though the exact lettering was unclear. They looked official enough, government or federal agents, perhaps. Relief nearly buckled my knees, but the men's expressions hardened when they saw us. One stepped forward, instructing the others to keep their guns raised. Mark held up his hands, urging calm. We poured out our story, the kidnappings, the possession, the monster we'd been fleeing. The lead agent, a tall man with graying hair, exchanged a tense look with his colleagues. He then motioned for us to get into one of the SUVs. We were rushed inside and told to remain silent. Chloe trembled beside me, clutching my arm. Beth leaned her head against the window, her eyes wide and vacant. Mark demanded to know who these men were and how they could help us. The tall man ignored him, speaking in hushed tones with someone on the radio. My gut twisted. Something was off. 10 minutes later, we were taken to a clearing where a helicopter waited. The agents shielded us from the thickening fog, hurrying us inside. I caught only fragments of their conversation, references to a contained area, talk of something called Operation Smoky Veal, and the urgent need to maintain secrecy. My alarm grew. Why did they care so much about secrecy? In the helicopter, none of the agents would answer our questions. They strapped us in, gave Beth some basic medical attention, though it looked more like they were collecting data than treating her. We lifted off, the rotors thundering, and soared over the forest canopy. My heart clenched, knowing that somewhere down there, Alex's body lay among the twisted trees, and Malik was still prowling. After what felt like an eternity, we landed in a clearing near a remote ranger station. The men guided us into a windowless building, ushered us into a single room, and told us to wait. My desperation flared. "We need to report what happened. Our friend," I began. But one of the men cut me off with a glare that promised consequences if I continued. We sat in silence. Chloe huddled next to Mark, and Beth was too weak to stand. After a few long minutes, the tall man returned with 3 other agents. One was carrying a black bag that he set on the table. The tall man looked at each of us, his eyes cold. "You will not speak of what you encountered," he said. "You will tell no one about your friend's death or about this creature." My mind spun. I wanted to scream at them, wanted answers. Mark took a step forward, fists clenched. But 2 of the agents unholstered their firearms in a flash. The tall man opened the black bag, revealing official-looking documents and forms. "You'll sign these," he instructed. "These state you were lost in the forest, found by rescue teams, and that your friend, Alex Ramsey, died in an unfortunate accident on unstable terrain." "How dare you?" Mark started, his voice trembling with anger. The agent's lips tightened. "Listen carefully. This is bigger than you. The entity you encountered has ties to a series of classified incidents. We can't allow mass hysteria. If you do not cooperate, you'll be charged with murder and conspiracy. Is that clear?" I felt raw panic and a flare of rage, but we had Chloe and Beth to protect. We were in no position to fight an entire government task force. I swallowed hard, tears burning my eyes. Beth, pale and near collapse, gave a tiny nod, a silent plea for us to comply. Mark and I signed. Chloe's hand shook as she signed her name. Within the hour, the agents transported us to a small medical facility, still far from any major town or city. They gave Beth some rudimentary care, then put us in a vehicle bound for home, with stern orders to keep silent. The drive back was a blur. By the time we reached our house, Chloe was a ghost of herself, her eyes hollow. Beth was still in shock, and Mark's hands wouldn't stop shaking. I wanted to cry the moment I crossed our threshold, but I was empty, consumed by grief and confusion. Weeks passed. We tried to get therapy, tried to heal. Beth eventually returned to her nursing job, but she was distant, haunted. Chloe barely spoke a word. Mark threw himself into work, refusing to talk about Alex. I was plagued by nightmares of Malik's eyes, and the memory of Alex's final moments. I replayed that entire week again and again, searching for a way we could have saved him, saved all of us. One evening, well after midnight, I woke from a nightmare, my throat dry. I went into the kitchen for water and peered outside through the window. Moonlight illuminated our backyard. That's when I saw it, just for an instant, a shadowy shape, tall and gaunt, disappearing behind a tree. My blood ran cold. Rationally, I told myself it was just my imagination, but a nagging intuition insisted otherwise. We tried to resume normal life, though normal had lost all meaning. Chloe continued to struggle with flashbacks. I scheduled as many counseling sessions for her as I could, but she never spoke about the events in the forest. When I pressed her, she only shook her head and said, "It's still there." One afternoon, a black SUV idled across the street from our house. I saw it when I got the mail. The tinted windows made it impossible to see who was inside, but I knew. My stomach twisted with fear and anger. They were watching us, ensuring our silence. The next day, the SUV was gone, replaced by another car, equally dark and conspicuous. In every reflection, I saw Malik's eyes or the agent's grim faces. Months later, rumors surfaced in local news about hikers disappearing in remote sections of the Appalachian Trail. The official statements blamed the disappearances on natural hazards, falls from cliffs, encounters with wild animals, or getting lost in unpredictable weather. But I knew better. Malik was still out there, lurking among the ancient trees, wearing a tattered facade of humanity. And I knew, too, that some branch of the government was working tirelessly to keep it quiet, to contain the terror in those woods at any cost. Every now and then, I still sense a presence in the periphery of my vision, like a shape shifting at the edges of my sight. Whether it's my own trauma or Malik's lingering influence, I can't be sure. All I know is something powerful and malevolent is entwined with that land, older than the oldest trees, feeding on fear, on souls. And while we might have escaped the forest, we can never truly escape Malik's shadow. That's my story. I wish it were only a nightmare. But it's my reality. It is a warning to anyone who dares to wander too far into the Appalachian wilderness without heeding the old legends. Sometimes, the dark secrets of the land are not meant to be disturbed. And sometimes, no matter how desperately you run, you can never truly escape the horrors you've faced. They linger, like a shadow, forever haunting your steps. It's me, Chris Evans. No, not Captain America, just a regular dude with an awesome name, and my best bud Dan. We're 22, fresh out of college, and about to embark on this epic camping trip to Stoke State Forest in New Jersey. Dan's moving across the country soon, and I'm starting this new job, so we figured, why not go out with a bang? You know, one last hurrah before adulting takes over, and all that. Stokes State Forest, I'd heard about it from some guys at school. Hiking trails, fishing spots, the whole shebang. But the real selling point, seclusion. Dan and I, we were craving a proper escape from the city, from our phones, from everything. Just us, the woods, and maybe a couple of beers. Now, I'm a bit of a planner, so naturally, I went full on Boy Scout with the packing. Tent, sleeping bags, warm clothes, because fall in New Jersey can be brutal. First aid kit, extra batteries for the flashlights, a compass, even an old school paper map. Hey, you never know when your phone's gonna die on you, right? Dan, of course, gave me grief about it. Dude, chill, he said. We're not exactly going to the Amazon. But hey, better safe than sorry, that's my motto. We rolled into Stokes late Friday afternoon. The leaves were mostly gone, and the trees looked all creepy and skeletal against the grey sky. There was this chilly wind that just seemed to seep right through you. We stopped at the ranger station, this tiny little shack off the main road. The ranger, this old guy with a weathered face and a limp, gave us the once-over. He looked at our gear, then at Dan, and said, "You boys heading deep into the ravine?" Dan, ever the joker, smirked and said, "Nah, just a couple of miles in." The ranger shook his head. "Stick to the marked trails," he grumbled. Don't wander off, especially after dark. I asked him if there was anything we should watch out for, like bears or whatever. He gave me this intense look, like he knew something I didn't. We've had some incidents, he said. People gone missing. This forest can be tricky. He didn't elaborate, and Dan just shrugged it off. Typical ranger talk, he said, trying to scare us, but I couldn't shake this feeling of unease. We drove as far as we could, parked the car, and started hiking. Right off the bat, we hit a snag. Dan's tent had this massive tear in it. We tried patching it up with duct tape, but it was pretty much a lost cause. Great, Dan said, just great. Then, to make matters worse, I realized we only had one set of working batteries for the flashlights. Dude, seriously, I said to Dan. You forgot the extras. He just grinned sheepishly. Oops. As we hiked deeper into the forest, the sun started to set, and the shadows grew longer. The wind howled through the trees, and the whole place felt off. And guess what? No phone service. Figures, I said. Dan just laughed. No distractions, right? Easy for him to say. We finally found a clearing near the ravine and set up camp. My tent was fine, but Dan's well, let's just say it was more like a tarp with some poles. Night fell fast. We built a fire, cooked up some noodles, and cracked open a couple of beers. For a while, things felt almost normal, until we heard it. This scream. It was like someone was being murdered. It echoed through the trees, and it sent chills down my spine. I swear, my heart stopped for a second. Dan looked at me, his face pale. What the hell was that? He whispered. I shook my head. No idea. We listened, but there was nothing. Just the wind and the crackling of the fire. Probably just a fox or something, Dan said, trying to sound brave. But I knew it wasn't a fox. That was a human scream. We didn't sleep much that night. Every little creak or rustle outside the tent had us jumping out of our skins. I kept replaying that scream in my head, trying to convince myself it was just some animal. But deep down, I knew it wasn't. Morning came, and the forest looked different. Less inviting, more menacing. Like something was watching us. We decided to check out the ravine, try to shake off the creepy vibes. The waterfalls were cool, and the stream was all sparkly and stuff. But then we found it. A deer carcass. Ripped to shreds. It was brutal. There was blood everywhere, and the flies were buzzing around like crazy. Dan looked like he was gonna puke. What the hell did this? He whispered. I checked the ground for tracks. There were these weird footprints. Long and clawed, unlike anything I'd ever seen before. Maybe a bear, Dan said, but I could tell he didn't believe it. Neither did I. We headed back to camp, both of us on edge. The forest felt different now, like it was closing in on us. I kept seeing things in the corner of my eye, shadows that disappeared when I looked directly at them. Dan tried to act tough, but I could tell he was freaked out too. That night, it got even colder. We built a huge fire, but it didn't seem to help. The shadows just seemed to get deeper, and the wind howled like a banshee. Then Dan started shivering. Really shivering. His teeth were chattering, and he couldn't stop. Dude, are you okay? I asked. He just shook his head and mumbled something about feeling cold. We decided to call it a night. I crawled into my tent, leaving the fire burning. I figured it would keep whatever killed the deer away. But I couldn't sleep. I kept thinking about those footprints, about that scream, about the shadows in the woods. Then I woke up. The fire was almost out, just a few embers glowing in the darkness. And Dan's tent, it was empty. His stuff was still there, but he was gone. I scrambled out of my tent, my heart pounding, and I yelled, "Ayen, where are you?" But there was no answer, just the wind and the silence of the forest. I grabbed my flashlight and started searching. I called his name until my throat was raw, but there was no sign of him. No footprints, no struggle, nothing. It was like he'd vanished into thin air. I spent the rest of the night wandering around the campsite, shining my flashlight into the darkness. I was terrified. Where was Dan? What had happened to him? Had whatever killed that deer taken him too? Just when I was about to give up, I saw something. A figure standing among the trees. It was tall and thin, and its eyes were glowing red in the darkness. I froze, my blood turning to ice. The figure didn't move, just stood there watching me. Then it turned and disappeared into the woods. I knew then that we were in serious trouble. Dawn finally broke, and I was exhausted, terrified, and starting to lose hope. I stumbled back towards our campsite, figuring I'd try searching in a different direction. And that's when I saw him. Dan, walking out of the trees like a zombie. His hair was a mess, his clothes were ripped, and his eyes were vacant. He looked like he hadn't slept in days. "Dan," I shouted, running towards him. "Where were you? What happened?" He just stared at me, like he didn't even recognize me. "Eyes in the dark," he mumbled. It called me. I grabbed his arm and shook him. "Dan, snap out of it. It's me, Chris." He blinked a few times and some of the fog seemed to clear from his eyes. "Chris," he said weakly. "I don't remember. I was asleep. And then I heard something whispering my name. And then I don't know." He looked around, confused and scared. I noticed these weird scratches on his arms, like claw marks. "Did something attack you?" I asked. He shook his head. "I don't know. I don't remember anything." I helped him back to the campfire and gave him some water. He was shivering like crazy, and not just from the cold. He looked sick, feverish. We spent the day huddled by the fire, trying to figure out what to do. Dan kept drifting off, mumbling about shadows and eyes in the dark. I wanted to get the hell out of there, but he was in no shape to hike back to the car. As the sun started to set, Dan got this weird look in his eyes. "It's still there," he whispered, watching us. "What is?" I asked, my heart starting to pound again. He turned to me, and his eyes were almost glowing in the firelight. "It wants me," he said. "I can feel it." And then we heard it, a branch snapping in the woods behind us. I grabbed my flashlight and shone it into the darkness. And there it was, the figure, tall and thin, with those glowing red eyes. It was standing just beyond the firelight, watching us. I felt this surge of adrenaline, this primal fear that just took over. I grabbed the can of lighter fluid we'd brought for the fire and chucked it onto the flames. The fire exploded, sending sparks and embers flying everywhere. The figure hissed and recoiled from the sudden burst of light. "We're leaving," I yelled, grabbing Dan's arm and pulling him to his feet. We didn't look back, we just ran. We sprinted through the woods, branches whipping at our faces, our lungs burning. I had no idea where we were going, just away from that thing. I could hear it crashing through the trees behind us, getting closer. Dan was stumbling, barely able to keep up. "It's in my head," he gasped. "The voice, it's telling me to go back." I ignored him and kept running. We had to get out of there. Finally, we burst out of the woods and onto a trail. I recognized it from our hike in, which meant we were heading in the right direction. But we were still miles from the car. I risked a glance over my shoulder. The figure was there, silhouetted against the moonlit sky, its eyes burning like embers. It let out this guttural scream, and I felt a wave of terror wash over me. We kept running, our legs screaming in protest. We had to reach the car, had to get out of this cursed forest. But when we finally stumbled out onto the dirt road, I realized with a sinking feeling that we were nowhere near the parking lot. We were lost. Just when I thought all hope was lost, I saw a light through the trees. It was faint, but it was there. "Come on, Dan," I said. "We have to reach that light." We staggered towards it, our bodies on the verge of collapse. And then we saw it. The ranger station. I pounded on the door, yelling for help. The old ranger opened it, his face grim. He took one look at Dan, who was practically unconscious, and ushered us inside. I blurted out the whole story, the scream, the carcass, the figure, everything. I probably sounded like a lunatic, but the ranger just nodded. "You saw what you saw," he said. "These woods are old, some things shouldn't be stirred up." He gave us blankets and coffee, and Dan collapsed on a cot. The ranger stayed up all night, watching the windows, this weird silver talisman dangling from his neck. I wanted to ask him what the hell was going on, but I was too exhausted. The next morning, Dan was delirious, mumbling about the creature. More rangers arrived, along with an EMT. They took Dan to the hospital, and I was left alone with the old ranger. He told me to wait for the police. "Have you ever seen anything like that before?" I asked him. He hesitated. "People disappear up here," he said quietly, "more often than you'd think." 3 days later, Dan woke up in the hospital with no memory of what had happened. When the police questioned me, I told them about the figure, but they didn't believe me. They said it was probably just a bear. But I knew better. I saw what I saw, and I knew the ranger knew it too. Dan left the state soon after, but he wasn't the same. He had nightmares, called me in the middle of the night, said he could feel something watching him. I went back home, tried to forget about it all, but I couldn't. I still have nightmares about that night, about the glowing eyes, about the scream. And sometimes, when I'm alone in the dark, I swear I can feel it watching me. Like it followed me home from the woods. So if you're ever thinking about camping in Stokes State Forest, be careful. Stick to the trails. And if you hear a scream in the distance, don't ignore it. Because sometimes the forest keeps what it lures in, and what it doesn't keep it leaves broken. My name is Jonathan Foster, and this is the story of how a simple camping trip with my friend Sam Reynolds turned into a terrifying encounter with the unknown. It was in Worthington State Forest, a place known for its dense woods and isolation, where everything I thought I knew about the world changed forever. Sam and I had been planning this trip for years. We both needed a break from the daily grind, and Worthington seemed like the perfect escape. Little did I know that we were walking into a nightmare. Sam, always the one for the strange and unusual, had mentioned the forest's history of unexplained disappearances. I dismissed it as one of his tall tales until we were already on our way. Our first day was met with an unexpected downpour. The trail we were following, one not found on any official map, quickly turned into a muddy mess. Sam, ever the optimist, just laughed it off as part of the adventure. We finally found a clearing near the Delaware River and set up camp as darkness closed in. That night, I was awakened by a chilling howl. It was unlike anything I'd ever heard, almost like a wolf, but with a disturbingly human-like quality to it. The next morning, we discovered strange tracks in the mud hoofprints that morphed into elongated shapes with claw marks. We tried to rationalize it, but a sense of unease settled upon us. Later that day, Sam, ever curious, stumbled upon an old hunting cabin. The place was dilapidated, but there were fresh footprints on the porch and a blood-stained knife lying on the rotting floorboards. Inside, we found small bone ornaments etched with strange symbols hanging from the rafters. Sam, in his typical impulsive fashion, pocketed one. That night, our food mysteriously vanished. Sam's backpack was gone. As we searched, the howling returned, closer this time. I saw it briefly, a tall, gaunt figure with antlers, its eyes glowing yellow in the darkness. Desperate to leave, we set off the next morning, only to find ourselves hopelessly lost. The forest seemed to have changed, the trail we followed now overgrown. We eventually stumbled upon a group of men in camouflage. At first, we were relieved, but their hostile demeanor quickly dispelled any hope of rescue. They accused us of trespassing and tied us up in their hidden camp. Their camp was a crude affair, hidden deep within the undergrowth. Tarps were strung between trees, offering meager shelter. Ammo boxes and discarded cans littered the ground, alongside the remains of recently killed animals. The air was thick with the coppery tang of blood. As I looked closer, I noticed more of those bone ornaments, like the one Sam had taken, hanging from the trees around the camp. These were cruder, less intricate, but undeniably similar. As the sun dipped below the horizon, casting long, menacing shadows through the trees, a palpable tension filled the air. The men, fueled by alcohol and suspicion, argued amongst themselves about what to do with us. Some were for letting us go, while others, their eyes cold and calculating, insisted we were a liability. Darkness descended, and the forest came alive with a symphony of unsettling sounds. The rustling of leaves, the snapping of twigs, and the distant cries of unseen creatures all contributed to a growing sense of dread. Then, the smell hit us, a wave of putrid decay, like rotting flesh, that made my stomach churn. And then, the howling began again, closer now, more insistent, sending chills down my spine. The men scrambled for their rifles, their faces pale with fear, shining their flashlights into the darkness. A scream pierced the night from the far side of the camp, cut short by a sickening gurgle. Panic erupted. The men shouted, fired their weapons blindly into the trees. In the chaos, a beam of light caught it, the creature I had glimpsed before. It was impossibly tall and emaciated, with elongated limbs and a crown of antlers that seemed to sprout from a nightmare. Its eyes glowed with an unnatural yellow light, and with a single swipe of its claw, it tore through two of the men as if they were made of paper. In the ensuing chaos, Sam, with a burst of adrenaline, somehow wrenched free of his restraints. He frantically searched for a weapon, his eyes darting around the campsite. He found a knife, dropped by one of the fallen poachers, and with desperate haste, he cut through my zip ties. We fled blindly into the night, the screams of the men and the creature's howls echoing behind us. We eventually made it out of the forest, forever scarred by our experience. What we encountered that night, I can't say for sure, but the legends of the Wendigo, a creature of Native American folklore, now hold a terrifying new meaning for me. The Wendigo is a malevolent spirit from Algonquian folklore, often depicted as a creature with human-like characteristics that possesses humans. It is associated with winter and is said to instill an insatiable hunger in its victims, driving them to cannibalism. Some describe it as a giant humanoid, its presence heralded by a foul stench or an unnatural chill. In most legends, humans transform into Wendigos because of their greed or weakness. Various indigenous traditions consider Wendigos dangerous because of their thirst for blood and their ability to infect otherwise healthy people or communities with evil. According to legend, the first Wendigo was a lost hunter driven to cannibalism by the harsh winter. After consuming human flesh, he transformed into a monstrous being, forever roaming the forests in search of more victims. Descriptions of the Wendigo vary. Some depict it as an emaciated figure with ashen skin, while others portray it as a giant, growing larger with each victim it consumes. It is often described with sharp claws and fangs, glowing eyes, and odor of decay. In Ojibwe, the term is defined as a winter cannibal monster, but its name may derive from the Proto-Algonquian word natiko,
Why?
meaning call. The Wendigo is believed to possess supernatural abilities, including enhanced senses, strength, and speed. It is said to inhabit the colder regions of North America, moving effortlessly through snow and ice. According to some legends, Wendigos can be killed with a conventional weapon, such as a club or firearm. Other legends claim that the Wendigo has to be somehow subdued, its icy heart cut out, and then melted in a roaring fire. A shaman may be the only person who can subdue and destroy a Wendigo, using either a silver, steel, or iron bullet or a dagger. Historically, indigenous peoples often accuse those exhibiting greed or engaging in cannibalism of being Wendigos. In the early 20th century, the term Wendigo found its way into Western medical vocabulary as Wendigo psychosis, used to describe individuals with delusions of becoming possessed by an evil spirit and experiencing cannibalistic to idealistic desires. Some believe that the Wendigo legend serves as a cautionary tale about the dangers of greed and the importance of community. In times of hardship, sharing resources and supporting one another were crucial for survival. The Wendigo, with its insatiable hunger, represents the consequences of selfishness and the breakdown of social bonds. According to historian Sean Smallman, the Wendigo is still seen as a symbol of greed in modern society, as manifested in capitalism and corporate consumerism. The Wendigo has also made its way into non-Indigenous literature and art. British writer Algernon Blackwood's novella, The Wendigo, 1910, tells the story of a mysterious monster hunting a campsite in the Canadian wilderness. And American novelist Stephen King features a Wendigo in the horror story Pet Sematary, 1983. While our experience in Worthington State Forest was terrifying, it's difficult to definitively say whether we encountered a Wendigo. However, there are striking similarities between our encounter and the creature described in Algonquian folklore. The chilling howls, the strange tracks, the emaciated figure with antlers, and the creature's insatiable hunger all align with descriptions of the Wendigo. The bone ornaments we found in the cabin and the similar ones in the poacher's camp could suggest some connection to the creature or those who worship it. Could it be that these men were a cult who worshipped the Wendigo, their camp a place of ritual and sacrifice? Or were they somehow involved in summoning or attracting the creature, their activities inadvertently leading to their own demise? It's also possible that Sam taking the bone charm from the cabin played a role in our encounter. Perhaps the charm was an offering to the Wendigo, or a symbol of protection for those associated with it. By taking it, Sam might have inadvertently attracted the creature's attention or angered those who revered it. While some may dismiss our story as a hallucination or a case of mistaken identity, I can't shake the feeling that we encountered something truly supernatural in those woods. The memory of that night, the creature's glowing eyes, and the screams of the men continue to haunt me to this day. Our encounter in Worthington State Forest remains a chilling reminder of the unknown that lurks in the shadows. The evidence, the howls, the tracks, the sightings, the bone ornaments, and the creature's insatiable hunger all point towards a terrifying possibility that what we encountered was indeed a Wendigo. This aligns with the core themes of the Wendigo legend, a cautionary tale about the dangers of greed and the importance of community. The poachers, with their disregard for the sanctity of the forest and their potential involvement with the creature, could be seen as a modern manifestation of the Wendigo's greed and destructive power. Whether we truly encountered a Wendigo or something else entirely, the experience has forever changed my perception of the world. The line between reality and myth has become blurred, and the possibility of the supernatural has become all too real. It's last summer, and I'm itching for a getaway. My husband, Mark, he's an accountant, the number-crunching kind, has been working himself to the bone. Seriously, the guy practically lives at the office. We barely see each other, let alone have any quality time with our daughter, Chloe. She just turned 10. By the way, a total nature enthusiast with a wild imagination. Anyway, I decided a camping trip might be just what the doctor ordered. You know, reconnect with nature, with each other, all that good stuff. So, we packed up our trusty, but slightly beat-up RV, and headed to the Great Swamp National Wildlife Refuge in New Jersey. I'd heard it was beautiful, all lush greenery and peaceful vibes. Little did I know what we were in for. Mark, bless his heart, picked our spot. A small clearing near this murky stream, surrounded by trees and what looked like miles of muddy trails. Now, I'm not gonna lie, the humidity was off the charts. Like, I could practically feel the moisture clinging to my skin. But Chloe, she was in her element. Totally oblivious to the swampy air, she was already off chasing dragonflies and spotting turtles, her little nature journal clutched in her hand. Seeing her so happy actually helped me relax a bit. We set up camp, surprisingly. It wasn't a complete disaster, even with our bargain bin gear. Though I did have my doubts about the tent. Water resistant, they called it, more like ready to fall apart at the slightest drizzle, if you ask me. But Mark, ever the optimist, just shrugged it off. Don't worry, babe, he said, the forecast is clear. Famous last words, right? Chloe was off exploring again, humming some made-up tune as she disappeared into the trees. It was then that we met him, the stranger. He just kind of materialized on the trail, looking like he'd been living in the woods for months. Ripped jeans, sweat, stained shirt. That whole wilderness man vibe. But there was something in his eyes, this haunted look, that sent chills down my spine. He gave us this creepy smile and asked, "You folks on vacation?" Mark, ever the friendly one, told him about our little family bonding trip. The stranger nodded, wiping his forehead with his hand. "Plenty of space out here for that," he said, his voice low and raspy. "Real quiet too. Just make sure you're back to the main road before nightfall." Then he looked at Chloe, who was peeking out from behind me. "Young ones shouldn't be out here alone," he said, his voice dropping even lower. "There's a group deeper in the swamp. Good folks. But they don't take kindly to strangers after dark." And with that, he just vanished. Back into the trees, like he was never there. But his words hung in the air, heavy and ominous. Good folks who don't like strangers. What did that even mean? I felt this knot of anxiety forming in my stomach. I told Mark we should stick to the marked trails, but he just laughed it off. "Don't be silly, Sarah," he said. "It's just some local superstition." Easy for him to say, right? That night, we huddled around a campfire, roasting marshmallows and trying to ignore the unsettling quiet. I mean, swamps are supposed to be noisy, right? With all the frogs and crickets and whatnot. But this place was eerily silent. Even the usual nighttime symphony of buzzing insects was absent. It was like the whole swamp was holding its breath, waiting for something to happen. Chloe, usually a chatterbox, was unusually quiet too. "Mom," she whispered, "where are all the frogs? I heard them earlier." I didn't have an answer. I just hugged her closer, trying to shake off the feeling that something was wrong. Really wrong. We finally turned in for the night, hoping for some peaceful sleep. But around midnight, I woke up with a jolt. Chloe wasn't in her sleeping bag. Panic surged through me as I scrambled out of the tent. And there she was, standing a few feet away, staring into the darkness. "Chloe, honey, what are you doing?" I hissed, rushing over to her. She looked dazed, almost trance-like. "I saw a lady," she mumbled, her voice barely a whisper. "She was wearing leaves. She said I was special." Okay, that's when the goosebumps officially erupted all over my body. I grabbed Chloe's hand and practically dragged her back to the RV, locking the door behind us. Mark, half asleep and grumpy, muttered something about sleepwalking. But I knew, deep down, that it was more than that. The next morning, despite my gut screaming at me to get the heck out of there, Mark insisted we explore deeper into the swamp. "We came all this way," he said. "And Chloe's fine. Fine." After seeing a lady made of leaves, I wasn't convinced, but I reluctantly agreed. We packed some snacks and water, and I made sure Chloe stayed glued to my side. As we ventured further into the swamp, the terrain got even worse. Our boots were sinking into the mud, and I was pretty sure I'd lost a shoe somewhere back there. But then I noticed something even more unsettling, strange symbols carved into the trees. Spirals, weird hand-like shapes with long, bony fingers. It was creepy as hell, and the silence, still there, pressing down on us like a heavy blanket. Then, the sky opened up. I'm talking a torrential downpour, the kind that turns trails into raging rivers. We tried to turn back, but we were hopelessly lost. Hours passed, and we were soaked to the bone, exhausted, and starting to panic. Just when I thought we were going to be spending the night huddled under a soggy tree, we spotted our RV through the sheets of rain. Relief washed over me as we scrambled inside, feeling like drowned rats. But the relief was short-lived. As darkness fell, I noticed that the silence had intensified. It was like the storm had sucked the life out of the swamp. No frogs, no crickets, no birds, nothing. And then, through the pouring rain, we saw them. Torches, flickering in the distance, moving towards us. My heart hammered in my chest. "Mark," I whispered, "something's wrong, really wrong." Before he could answer, there was a loud banging on the RV door. A voice boomed from outside.
"Open up, we won't hurt you." "Yeah, right."
Like I was going to fall for that. Mark grabbed the small axe we kept for firewood, yelling, "Stay back." But it was no use. The door burst open, and a group of figures rushed in. They were covered in mud, their eyes wild and crazed, and their faces, well, let's just say, looked like they'd been painting themselves with something a lot darker than mud. One of them, this huge guy with a crazed look in his eyes, tackled Mark to the ground. Another grabbed me, forcing me down. Chloe screamed. This high-pitched, terrified sound that still echoes in my nightmares. I struggled to get to her, to protect her, but one of them kicked me hard in the ribs, and the world exploded in pain. When I could see again, Chloe was gone. Mark was unconscious, blood trickling from a gash on his head, and the intruders vanished. Just like that, I crawled over to Mark, shaking him until he woke up. He looked around, dazed and confused, then his eyes widened in horror. "Slow," he croaked, his voice hoarse. I felt my own panic rising, threatening to consume me. "They took her, Mark," I choked out. "We have to get her back." He struggled to his feet, swaying unsteadily. My first thought was to call the police, but we were miles from civilization, with no cell service. We were on our own. Mark tried to start the RV, but the engine wouldn't turn over. They'd sabotaged it. We were stranded, trapped in this nightmare with no way out. But I couldn't just give up. Chloe needed me. So, with the last bit of battery life in our flashlight, we stumbled out into the darkness, following the muddy footprints left by the intruders. Every step was an agonizing battle against fear and despair. But I pushed on, fueled by adrenaline and a mother's love. We followed the trail deeper and deeper into the swamp, the darkness closing in around us. The air was thick with the smell of decay, and the silence was almost unbearable. Then, we stumbled upon a clearing. It was a scene straight out of a horror movie. Animal bones, deer, maybe, or fox were arranged in a grotesque shrine, draped with rotting hides. The stench was overwhelming, and on the trees, carved into the bark, were those same symbols we'd seen earlier. My stomach churned, but we had to keep going. Suddenly, a figure emerged from the shadows. I almost screamed, but then I saw the fear in his eyes. He was just a kid, barely out of his teens, his clothes torn and dirty. He looked like he'd been through hell. "Don't be scared," he whispered, his voice trembling. "I'm not with them. Not anymore." He told us he'd been lured into the cult, promised a community, a sense of belonging. But he'd quickly realized the truth, the rituals, the sacrifices. He'd tried to escape, but they'd caught him, branded him with one of those awful symbols. He pointed to a crudely carved mark on his chest. "They said the swamp would claim me if I ever tried to leave," he whispered. He told us where they'd taken Chloe, a hidden clearing deeper in the swamp. "They'll do the ritual before sunrise," he said, his voice filled with urgency. "Please, you have to save her." With the young man, whose name, I learned, was Ben, leading the way, we plunged deeper into the swamp. The rain had stopped, but the darkness was thick and suffocating. Every rustle of leaves, every snap of a twig sent shivers down my spine. I clung to Mark's hand, my heart pounding with a mixture of hope and terror. Finally, we saw it, a flickering firelight in the distance, casting long, eerie shadows through the trees. As we crept closer, we could hear chanting, a low rhythmic drone that sent chills down my spine. And then we saw them. A group of figures, their faces painted with that same dark substance, were gathered around a bonfire. In the center, bound and kneeling on a makeshift altar, was Chloe. My breath caught in my throat. She looked so small, so vulnerable. An older woman, draped in what looked like swamp grass and feathers, stood over her, chanting in a language I didn't understand. This must be the Cladian leaves Chloe had seen. Mark handed me the flashlight, his eyes grim. He whispered a quick plan, something about creating a diversion. Then he disappeared into the shadows. I watched, my heart in my throat. As he crept towards the edge of the clearing, the chanting grew louder, more intense. The woman raised her arms, and I saw a glint of something sharp in her hand. It was now or never. Suddenly, a commotion erupted on the other side of the clearing. Mark had set fire to one of the huts. Flames roared into the night sky, and the cultists scattered in panic. I seized the opportunity, sprinting towards the altar, adrenaline coursing through my veins. I swung the flashlight with all my might, connecting with the woman's head with a sickening thud. She crumpled to the ground, and I rushed to untie Chloe, who burst into tears and clung to me, sobbing. "Mum," she cried. I was so scared. "It's okay, honey," I soothed. "We here now." Just then, Mark appeared, panting and wielding the axe. He took one look at the woman, who was starting to stir, and with a swift, decisive motion, silenced her forever. We fled, the flames licking at our heels, the chanting and screams of the cultists echoing behind us. Ben, the young man who had helped us, pointed towards a small canoe hidden in the reeds. We scrambled in, paddling frantically as the fire raged behind us. We didn't stop until we reached a narrow creek that led us out of the swamp. By some miracle, we found a service road and eventually flagged down a truck driver who took us to the nearest town. The police were called, but by the time they reached the clearing, the cult had vanished. All that remained were ashes and the lingering smell of smoke. We returned home, physically safe but emotionally scarred. Chloe still has nightmares, and I can't shake the feeling that a part of her is still trapped in that swamp, in the grip of those terrifying rituals. We survived, yes, but at what cost? The great swamp, once a symbol of peace and tranquility, now holds a dark and terrible secret. A secret that continues to haunt us in the quiet hours of the night. The Pine Barrens of South Jersey, that's where I ended up. Me, Michael Reed, 38 years old, and fresh off 2 tours that left me craving nothing but silence. The city noise was a constant assault, and the pitting looks from folks back home. Those who thought they understood what those nights in the desert were like were enough to make me want to crawl into a hole and disappear. So, I found this beat up cabin near Devil's Fork Creek. Figured I'd go off-grid, live off the land, and let the whispering pines and the still, dark water soothe the edges of my frayed nerves. Turns out, solitude can be a real double-edged sword. Yeah, the quiet was a blessing. But the leaky roof, and the groaning walls, like the whole damn cabin, was about to collapse in on itself, were a constant reminder that I was alone out there, surrounded by something ancient and wild. My days fell into a rhythm, checking traps for rabbits and squirrels, chopping enough firewood to keep warm, and trying to keep my makeshift water filter from clogging with God knows what. I kept a journal, too. Not much to write about, really. Just the temperature, how I was feeling, which was mostly numb, punctuated by bursts of anxiety, and whatever wildlife I saw, or thought I saw. See, the Pine Barrens have this reputation. People whisper about strange sightings, weird lights in the sky, things that go bump in the night. The Jersey Devil, they call it. Part of me thought it was all just campfire stories, the kind of thing you tell to scare tourists. But there was another part, the part that woke up in a cold sweat with my heart hammering, that wasn't so sure. 6 months in, just when I was starting to feel like maybe I could actually live like this, my brother, David, shows up. Out of the blue. I remember it clear as day. The sun was setting, painting the whole damn forest in this blood-red light. I was out back, splitting logs, when I hear this string of curses echoing through the trees. Then, out pops David, dragging this massive duffel bag behind him. "Hey, little bro," he says, grinning like he hadn't just materialized from thin air. Something about him felt off. He looked rough stubble, dark circles under his eyes, clothes torn like he'd been wrestling a bear. His boots were practically falling apart. We hadn't spoken in years, and seeing him standing there felt like a punch to the gut. "What the hell are you doing here?" I asked, my voice coming out sharper than I intended. The Barons had done that to me, made me territorial, like a goddamn wolf guarding its den. "Just passing through," he says with a shrug. "Heard you had a place. Figured I'd crash for a night or two." Part of me wanted to tell him to get lost, but he was my brother, and the thought of him wandering those woods alone was enough to make me cave. So, I let him in. He tossed the duffel bag on the rickety table, and I heard this clinking sound, like metal on metal. Didn't ask. Maybe I should have. That night, we ate beans and some jerky I'd made. He told me he was looking for work, but his hands were shaking, and he kept glancing at the windows like he expected someone to jump out at us. There was more to his story, that much I knew. It was just a matter of time before it all came spilling out. The next morning, I figured it was time to introduce David to the only other person I'd met out in the Barrens, a woman named Mary. She was a survivalist, a goddamn herbalist, and lived about 2 miles through the thick of it. Mary was the only one who didn't seem spooked by this place. She had this long, grey braid and eyes that seemed to hold the reflection of the whole damn forest. When we got to her homestead, she was outside, chopping up some plants on a makeshift table. "Brought you some of that venison," I said, handing her a package wrapped in cloth. "Figured we could trade." She nodded, her eyes already on David, and handed me a jar. "Homemade salve, for the bug bites." "My brother," I said, nodding towards David. "David, this is Mary." Mary's lips tightened. "The Pine Barrens ain't kind to outsiders," she said, her voice low and steady. "Strange things wake up when strangers roam these woods." David snorted. "Is that so?" Mary just shrugged, but I knew that look in her eyes. It was a warning. She'd given me that look before, when I told her about wanting to explore deeper into the woods. She'd always cautioned me about certain areas, about how the forest had its own rules. It was easy to write her off as a bit eccentric, but I'd learned to trust her gut. Back at the cabin, things started to get real. I was out gathering firewood when I found these massive hoof prints in the mud. Way bigger than any deer I'd ever seen. And they were spaced out like something was walking on 2 legs, not 4. I followed them to the creek, but they just vanished on the rocky bank. When I told David, he just brushed it off. "Someone messing with you," he said. But I couldn't shake the feeling that something wasn't right. That night, I heard voices, whispering just outside the cabin. I crept to the window, expecting to see a coyote or some lost hiker, but there was nothing. Just the wind rustling through the pines. A couple nights later, things went from bad to worse. I was inside, stirring a pot of soup, when David bursts in, slamming the door behind him. He looked like he'd seen a ghost. "What's wrong?" I asked, grabbing my hunting knife. "Trouble," he gasped, his chest heaving. "Men in the woods. They followed me." My stomach clenched. "Why the hell are they following you?" He hesitated, his eyes darting to the duffel bag. "They might be looking for something I borrowed." Before I could get anything more out of him, a flashlight beam cut across the window. 3 figures outside. Fear surged through me, but I forced myself to think. I told David to get down, douse the lantern, and we crouched in the darkness. Voices drifted through the thin walls. "David," one of them called. "We know you're in there. Come out and we won't hurt your friend." Yeah, right. Like I was going to buy that. I motioned for David to stay put, my heart hammering against my ribs. I heard them circling the cabin, the floorboards creaking under their weight. Then, a sharp scraping sound. They were trying to pry the door open. I inched towards the corner where I kept my rifle. I'd kept it clean, oiled, just in case I needed to defend myself from wild animals. Now, it looked like I might need it for something else entirely. "Michael," the voice called again. "You don't want this fight." My blood ran cold. How the hell did they know my name? David had told them more than he'd let on. They started banging on the door, yelling about shooting if we didn't come out. My hands were shaking, memories of firefights flashing through my mind. Then, all hell broke loose. The door splintered inwards, and I fired a warning shot. One of them yelled, and they started shooting back. Bullets ripped through the cabin, whizzing past our heads. We ducked behind the table, the flimsy thing barely offering any cover. I got lucky and hit one of them in the shoulder. He went down with a yell, and his buddies dragged him back, firing wildly as they retreated. The cabin was a mess. Windows shattered, glass everywhere. Between the muzzle flashes, I'd seen their faces, twisted with rage. And David, his face white as a sheet. When it was finally over, when the ringing in my ears subsided, I turned on David. "What the hell is going on?" I demanded. He finally confessed. He'd stolen a stash of drug money from some very bad people, and he'd planned on hiding out here, using me and my isolated cabin as cover. Anger surged through me, but what the hell was I going to do? Kick him out in the middle of the night, with those guys still out there? We spent a sleepless night patching up the door as best we could. Dawn revealed the full extent of the damage. Bullet holes, shattered windows, and a trail of blood leading into the woods. "We need help," I said, my voice tight. "Mary might know what to do." It took us an hour to reach her place. When she saw us, both of us bruised, bleeding, and scared shitless, her face hardened. "They'll be back," she said grimly. "Both the men and the forest. You stirred something up, Michael, letting this trouble in." David scoffed, but I knew better than to ignore her. While she cleaned the graze on my arm, I told her about the hoof prints, the whispers. "That's the Baron's way," she said, her voice low. "These woods protect their own secrets. And if you come here with ill intentions, something out there will notice." Her words sent a chill down my spine. "We need a place to hide," I said, my voice barely a whisper. "Just until we can figure things out." She thought for a moment, her eyes distant. "There's a cave system a few miles south. Might keep you safe for a day or two, but it ain't comfortable." Reluctantly, we decided to head back to the cabin. At least there we had supplies. On the way, we saw more of those damn hoof prints. Deeper this time, some with claw marks alongside them. David tried to joke about the Jersey Devil, but neither of us laughed. The woods were too quiet. No birds, no wind, just this heavy stillness that made my skin crawl. That night, we barely spoke, just sat there, listening to every creak and groan of the cabin, waiting for those thugs to come back. But they didn't. Instead, we heard something else. Low growls, rasping breaths just outside the walls. Then, scratching, like something with long, sharp claws was trying to tear its way in. David peeked out the window, and his face went white as a sheet. "There's something out there," he whispered, his voice trembling. "Tall, with red eyes." I didn't want to believe him, but the scraping sounds were getting louder, closer. My whole body was on high alert. The same way it used to be in those desert nights, when you knew the enemy was out there, but you couldn't see them. The scratching stopped just before dawn. We crept outside, and the sight that greeted us made my blood run cold. Claw marks raked across the door, the windows. Blood smeared on the porch. Animal blood, maybe. But the stench that hung in the air, it was something else entirely. Something primal, something that screamed danger. "We gotta get to Mary's," I said, my voice tight. "No." David, for once, didn't argue. We packed what we could carry. And as we stepped onto the path, those three bastards stepped out from behind the trees. The leader had a bandage on his shoulder where I'd winged him. He glared at us like we were already dead. David dropped the duffel bag and put his hands up. I did the same, my mind racing. They barked orders, told us to walk deeper into the woods. One of them smacked David with his gun when he stumbled. Another one kept cursing me out for shooting his buddy. I kept glancing over my shoulder, half expecting to see those red eyes, that creature from the night. But the only threat, at that moment, was human. They finally stopped in a small clearing. It was dark under the thick canopy, the air heavy and still. The leader sneered at David, called him a dead man. David, the idiot, started trying to bargain. Said he'd stashed some of the money, that he could lead them to it if they let us go. I was furious. Bargaining with my life, with my brother's life, like it was all some goddamn game. Then, the wind picked up. I saw something move in the trees above us. A shape, perched on a thick branch. Long limbs, a hunched back. My breath caught in my throat. Before I could say anything, the thugs saw it too. One of them shone his flashlight up into the branches. A screech ripped through the air, like a wildcat crossed with something else. The shape lunged down, crashing into one of the thugs. He screamed, and before my eyes, he was dragged into the undergrowth. The flashlight spun wildly, illuminating thrashing limbs, then went dark. "Run," I yelled. The thugs scattered, their tough guy act gone in an instant. David bolted, but two of them grabbed him, trying to use him as a shield. I sprinted after them. Another screech echoing through the trees, followed by a sickening crunch. I lost sight of David in the chaos. The thugs were screaming about demons, firing their guns blindly. Then I heard David yell my name. A muffled cry. I found a trail. Trampled through the undergrowth, leading deeper into the barrens, towards Devil's Fork Creek. I followed it, my heart pounding. I stumbled into a clearing, an old altar made of rotting wood and animal bones. Symbols carved into the trees. The stench of decay was overwhelming, and there, tied to a post, was David. His eyes were wide with terror, his skin scraped raw. Around him, the remains of the thugs, torn apart, shredded. I rushed forward to cut him loose, but a hiss stopped me dead in my tracks. From the shadows, that shape emerged, red eyes burning in the darkness, twisted horns. My rifle felt useless. Mary's words echoed in my mind. These woods protect their own secrets. I yelled at David to look away, to close his eyes. I raised the rifle and fired. The muzzle flash lit up the clearing, revealing the creature for a split second. It recoiled, roaring, the sound rattling my teeth. I must have hit it. It lunged sideways, giving me just enough time to cut David free. He collapsed into my arms, barely conscious. I slung him over my shoulder and stumbled back, keeping the rifle raised. The creature melted back into the darkness, circling us. Every step I took, I felt its presence, like it was right behind me, waiting to pounce. Somehow, we made it out of the clearing, onto a faint trail. David was mumbling delirious. I half carried, half dragged him through the woods. We crossed the creek at a shallow bend, the water icy cold against my legs. I didn't dare look back. The trees loomed over us, the sky a sliver of moonlight. When we finally reached the cabin, dawn was breaking. I dragged David inside, dumped him on the tattered couch. He was babbling, his eyes rolling back in his head, like he'd seen something that shattered his mind. I tried to clean his wounds, but I couldn't tell which ones were from the thugs and which ones were from that thing. In the grey morning light, the cabin felt different. Not a refuge anymore, a cage. I heard something scuttling across the roof, a long, scraping sound that made me want to cover my ears. David was slipping in and out of consciousness. There was nothing I could do but wait. Exhaustion finally took me, and I dozed off. When I woke, the couch was empty. David was gone. Panic surged through me. I scrambled out of the cabin, the morning air cold against my skin. "David," I yelled, my voice hoarse. "David, where are you?" The forest was silent, no birdsong, no wind. Just the echo of my own voice bouncing off the trees. I searched the clearing, the path to Mary's, the creek. Nothing. Then, I saw them. Fresh hoof prints in the mud near the porch. Bigger than any I'd seen before. They led into the woods. Desperation clawed at me. I followed those prints, stumbling through the undergrowth, until I reached the clearing where the thugs had ambushed us. It was different. No sign of the altar, no bodies, just a few smears of blood on the ground. Like the forest had swallowed it all up. My hope of finding David alive dwindled with every step. I stumbled back to the cabin as dusk settled, my mind a whirlwind of fear and guilt. Maybe I could find Mary, maybe I could get to a phone, call the authorities. But the cabin's radio had always been weak, and my cell phone had died months ago. The nearest town was miles away, and night was coming. the whispering started again, drifting through the trees just outside the cabin walls. I slammed the door shut, my heart in my throat. In the dim light of the lantern, I noticed something I hadn't seen before. Scratches on the walls, deep gouges in the wood, forming patterns. Runes, maybe. Or maybe my exhausted mind was playing tricks on me. I should have left that night. Should have hiked through the darkness until I found help. But something held me back. The thought of leaving David, alive or dead, to whatever was out there. I couldn't do it. And a deeper, more primal fear whispered that I couldn't outrun whatever had its sights on me. So, I stayed, rifle in hand, eyes glued to the door. Days blurred together. I barely slept, haunted by nightmares and the constant fear of something lurking just outside. Sometimes, I'd see David's face in the window, but when I ran outside, there was nothing there. Other times, I'd hear a hiss from under the floorboards, or the thud of hooves on the porch. I saw those hoof prints again, circling the cabin, waiting. I don't know how this ends. I'm trapped here, caught between my own guilt and the fear that claws at my sanity. The Pine Barrens took my brother, and I have a feeling they're not done with me yet. Every night, the wind whispers my name, and something taps against the walls. When I dare to look outside, I see those red eyes staring back at me through the trees. My name is Michael Reed. I'm 38 years old. I came here to find peace, to escape the ghosts of war. Instead, I found something far worse. Something ancient, something hungry. If you're reading this, stay away from Devil's Fork Creek. Stay away from the Pine Barrens. Once this place sets its sights on you, there's no escape. And I fear my time is running out.